The late afternoon drifted slowly past the tall skeletal trees lining the edge of the suburbs, where the last golden ribbons of sunlight filtered through the canopy like molten threads unraveling down onto the dew-dampened pavement. Hope rested both hands on the steering wheel, her head tilted slightly toward the half-open window, letting the gentle wind brush through her soft brown hair, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves, hot asphalt, and the quiet dust of a day preparing to fold itself away. In the passenger seat, Rowan sat absorbed in a few folded notes from a recent wildlife conservation seminar. The paper neatly creased between his knees, eyes skimming the words with a focus that drifted, as if his thoughts had wandered far beyond the margins. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence between them held a kind of peace. A silence deep enough to hear the wind slide past the windows, soft enough not to require filling. The road ahead seemed forgotten by time, untouched by the pulse of the city. A gentle curve unfurled along a slope, flanked on the left by sparse pines and on the right by a sun-scorched patch of wild grass, browned by the heat of September. No one could have guessed that on this stretch of quiet road, a turning point would reveal itself, not from a traffic sign, not from blinking lights, but from a single soul crossing the final threshold of despair. It happened all at once. A sudden blur tore through the stillness, like something had fallen out of the sky. Before Hope could react, a large figure, dust-covered, ragged, and wild-eyed, hurled itself through the rear window of the car. The sound landed like a soft explosion, claws scraping leather seats, a heavy body slamming the floor, brakes shrieking through the haze of dust. Rowan jolted upright, eyes wide in disbelief. Hope gripped the wheel tightly as the car shuddered, and then came to a full stop, her heart pounding like it had just been yanked awake from an afternoon dream. Silence returned, but not the same kind. It was thicker now, pressed in tight like the pause between breaths after fate has struck. Hope turned around. Her eyes met the curled form in the back seat. A German shepherd, massive yet skeletal, lay trembling in the corner. Its ribs pressed sharply beneath a matted coat stained with soot and shadow, fur tangled and discolored like ash. Its eyes, those eyes, were impossible to name. Panic, distrust, and some kind of pain that looked almost human flickered behind them. It didn't howl, it didn't bark, it didn't whimper, it just shook. Long, invisible tremors rolling through its frame, as if merely existing in this space had taken the last ounce of strength it had. "Hope," Rowan's voice cracked, hushed by shock. "Did you see?" "I did," she answered, gaze never leaving the dog. "It just jumped in." Neither of them moved, as though any motion might rupture the fragile bubble of disbelief still hanging in the air. Slowly, Hope reached behind, opened the center console, and rummaged for the leftover crumbs of a week-old pack of crackers. She tore a small piece and placed it gently on the seat beside the dog, then pulled her hand back as if afraid to brush against the pain still clinging to its skin. The animal didn't stir. Its eyes remained open, round and distant, like the surface of a winter lake untouched by sunlight. Rowan slowly opened his door and circled to the back. He crouched, extending a hand, not to touch, just to hover in the space between. "Hey there, you okay?" His voice was soft, the kind you'd use with a child crying in their sleep. But the moment his fingers drew closer, the dog flinched, its body tensing like wire, a sound bursting from its throat, hoarse and cracked. Not a growl, not a cry. Something more like the dying breath of a fear that had lived too long. "Wait," Hope whispered, stepping out behind him. She knelt by the door, her eyes softening like a blanket thrown over a storm. "I don't think it's running from us," she murmured. "It's running from something far worse." Rowan nodded, the panic fading from his eyes, replaced by something quieter. What sat before them was not just a stray. It was a soul that had once known love, had once been held, had once believed the world had a place for it, until it was dropped from that belief and forced to survive in the wilderness of betrayal and violence and neglect. Hope whispered, "Why us? Why our car?" No one could answer that, not even the dog. But in the long silence that stretched between falling light and racing heartbeats, Hope placed a hand over her chest. She wasn't sure if she had the time, the space, or the knowledge to heal a soul like that. But she knew one thing. When a creature with nothing left chooses to trust you, you owe it to them to prove that trust was not a mistake. She looked at Rowan. "We can't leave it here." He held her gaze for a long moment, as though searching for the answer in her quiet certainty. He said nothing, didn't nod, didn't protest, just turned and gently closed the back door, sealing off the last flicker of twilight from the figure curled like a shadow, too soft for this wide, loud world. The car moved again, slowly rolling across the shattered leaves like lost memories no one bothered to pick up. Hope glanced at the rearview mirror now and then. The dog remained still, untouched by motion, untouched by sound, untouched even by the bit of cracker sitting just inches from its paw. It didn't look out the window. It didn't look at them. It stared instead into the narrow space between the seat and the car wall, where the dim light sketched a silver stripe along its back, cold and quiet as sun through a broken rooftop. Hope turned on a soft guitar tune, instrumental, then turned it off just as quickly, afraid that even one high note might crack the delicate stillness that now surrounded the car. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely louder than the wind. "It doesn't eat, doesn't look, doesn't make a sound. Rowan, that look in its eyes scares me." Rowan kept his eyes fixed on the road. "Aren't you afraid it might bite?" She shook her head. "I'm afraid it might never trust again." The space between them was not exactly a disagreement, but rather a kind of distance born from silence, the kind that settles in when you sense you are about to step into something far larger than your own readiness. And yet the words for it have not quite found their voice. The car turned onto the dirt road leading to their suburban home. A modest wooden house, not overly modern, but warm enough in winter and airy enough in summer. The white fence at the front gate had faded with time, and the wildflower garden, though never meticulously trimmed, always bloomed gently in the early mornings. Hope pulled the car to a stop, turned off the engine, and then shifted her whole body to face him. "We won't touch it, won't force anything, just leave it here tonight. If by morning it wants to go, I won't stop it." Rowan said nothing, just nodded, a subtle motion. Hope opened the back door and stepped toward Patch with a long breath that felt like it carried more than air. She sat on the edge of the seat, one hand resting lightly on her thigh, the other open, palm up, a few inches from Patch's nose. No food, no sweet coaxing, just the fullness of her presence. Quiet, undemanding, and whole. Patch tilted his head slightly, his gaze not quite meeting hers but passing through her, as if he were weighing something far beyond this moment, something not yet ready to be named. Time passed. The sun had already dipped behind the distant row of houses, leaving behind a pale, fractured orange glow that clung to the sky like an afterthought. Hope rose, walked to the front door, then looked back. At Rowan, at Patch, in a gaze that hovered somewhere between quiet hope and reluctant surrender. Rowan stepped forward and opened the car door wide. I won't force it either, he said, slow but steady. But I'm not letting you do this alone. He went inside first, returned with an old blanket, and laid it down on the rug beside the sofa. Hope placed a bowl of water and a tray of dry food beside it, everything arranged with the care one might reserve for a guest who never knocks. Then she returned to the car once more, crouching down beside Patch. If you want to stay. The door is open, she said, in a tone she never imagined she would use for anyone. A minute passed, then another. Patch didn't move. But by the third minute, something shifted. Not a leap, not even a firm step, just a small motion. The front of his body edged slightly forward, his nose inching closer to the spill of light coming through the doorway. And then he stood, unsteady, trembling, as though he were resisting an entire past pressing down between his shoulders. Patch stepped out of the car, without a sound. His claws touched the earth like notes too fragile to be spoken, and each step became a quiet negotiation between fear and the fragile weight of hope. Rowan watched, his eyes deep and unreadable. Hope said nothing. She simply walked ahead, guiding as though all of this had already been written, as though the dog hadn't just been brought here, but rather this place had been waiting for him all along. The threshold of the wooden house opened into a small courtyard, scattered with crushed stones and fallen leaves. Inside, the warm light of a table lamp spilled onto the honey-colored wooden floor, shaping a space just cozy enough to soothe tired feet that had wandered too far, hearts that had long lost their bearings. Patch paused on the porch, body rigid, as though caught between the fading grip of a past still clinging outside and the flicker of something barely formed at the doorway. Hope did not turn around. She simply opened her palm, held it backward, a gesture without words, one of waiting and quiet trust. And Patch, after seconds that stretched longer than a storm, stepped inside. The air within the house was thick with the scent of aged wood, the remnants of chamomile tea in a porcelain cup, and the lingering essence of a home that hadn't opened itself to strangers in a very long time. Patch didn't explore, didn't sniff at the corners. He walked carefully to the blanket Rowan had laid out, curled into himself in a hushed circle, like a wound that had just found its bandage. Hope knelt down, keeping just enough distance to avoid startling him, and only then began to inch closer. Close enough finally to truly see. Around Patch's neck, a ring of fur had thinned, uneven, brittle, scorched at the edges, as if once clamped tight by something far rougher, more persistent than mercy. Beneath it, a faint scar ran under the remaining fur, not bleeding anymore, but etched deep with a story no words had ever told. No one needed to say it. No vet needed to confirm. Hope knew exactly what had once held that soul captive, a chain. Not just a tether, but a sentence, an abuse, a mark pressed in by time and abandonment. "Rowan," she whispered. "Look!" He came forward, his gaze softening like water disturbed by wind. He said nothing, only lowered himself beside her, hand resting on his knee, eyes fixed on the scar. He inhaled deeply, then exhaled in a silence heavier than speech. Patch didn't react. Though watched, though approached, he neither flinched nor fled. The way he lay there, motionless, withdrawn into the smallest shape his body could make, was like a door long sealed, now open not out of hope, but because there was simply nothing left to hold it shut. "We need to call a vet," Rowan said, his voice dry as old paper. "There may be more than we can see." Hope nodded, but before she could place the call, she turned back to Patch and asked, not as an interrogation, but like an offering, "What's your name?" Of course, there was no reply, only the same empty gaze, free of judgment, apology, or need, as if every name had been shed somewhere along the road Patch had traveled, and what remained now was something beyond naming altogether. "So, mind if I give you a name, just for now?" Hope said, but this time she didn't wait for permission. She looked at the scar on the neck, the matted fur, the grime that clung like dust from forgotten years, and offered a small, mournful smile. "Patch, I'll call you Patch." Rowan tilted his head. "Because of the missing fur." Hope shook her head slowly, eyes still fixed on the dog. "Number. Because, like scraps of fabric stitched together, he's being pieced back, bit by bit." The room fell quiet again. Outside the window, the wind stirred the pines, making a sound like the long, weary breath of a forest too far to reach. The bowl of water next to Patch remained full, the food untouched. Both of them knew that Patch's hunger did not live in the stomach. It lived somewhere deeper, where no medicine or meal could reach. Hope didn't leave. She laid a pillow on the floor, sat down cross-legged, her eyes following every flicker of movement, not to control, but to be present. A silent message in her stillness said, "I'm here. When you're ready, I'll still be here." Rowan brought her a cup of warm tea, set it gently beside the mat, and sat down against the wall, arms crossed, eyes softer now, not wary, but quietly learning how to listen to things that had no voice. Time moved more slowly than usual, as if each second was pulled tight between the threads of fear and fragile hope, as if this night were not ordinary at all, but a threshold, one every broken soul must cross before choosing to stay. The soft light of the room played gently on the curtains, casting shadows of Hope and Patch long across the aged wooden floor, like echoes of something unspoken still hanging in the air. Patch didn't move. He lay there, curled like a cinder still warm from a distant firestorm. His gaze was fixed, not in awareness, but in that hollow stare of a being unsure if it truly existed. Hope remained, her fingers gently rolling the teacup in her palm, letting the rising steam blend into the rhythm of her breathing, her eyes never leaving the emaciated creature before her. She didn't speak. She didn't coax. Her presence carried no expectation, no rescue, only the full weight of someone who chose to wait. And in that room, every blink from Patch, every twitch of his leg like a reflex from old pain, rose like soft notes from a violin still being tuned in the silence. Rowan had dozed off against the wall, head dipped, the steady breathing of a man who bore more thoughts than he ever said aloud. Hope stayed where she was, resting her head on her knee, palm left open on the rug as if offering a space, just in case Trust decided to wander near. The night thickened. Darkness no longer felt menacing, but instead became a velvet curtain draped over what could not yet be named. The clock struck 1. The only sounds now were the wind brushing faintly at the windows and the rasped breathing of Patch, like the breath of someone who had swum far too long through an ocean of fear and finally found a ledge to cling to. Hope shifted slightly and opened a small container from her bag, pulling out a slice of ham she'd saved from lunch. The scent drifted into the room, not sharp, not overpowering, but warm, familiar like a memory's quiet embrace. Patch flinched. A stir passed through him, not from the smell of food, but from something older awakening inside, a hunger no longer completely drowned by terror. Hope didn't rush. She didn't reach toward him. She simply placed the slice in her open hand, laid it gently on the rug before her. She did not move it closer, did not pull away. She let the moment unfold at the pace of a heartbeat still trembling on the other side of fear. Patch's eyes flickered. One ear tilted, slightly, but enough to know he was listening. He remained curled tight, yet the subtle shift of his head hinted at a war being waged inside, between a hunger that had gnawed too long and the trauma of every time he'd dared to reach and been struck back. Minutes passed, then more. Hope never moved. She remained, hand open, eyes gentle and unpressing. And finally, Patch moved, not with a leap, not with trust, but with a motion so small it felt like the very first beat of a heart thawing in the aftermath of frost. One step, pause, another, hesitation. Then, in a soundless breath, his nose touched her hand, not biting, not snatching, not frantic, but bowing low, gently picking up the meat, then retreating to his place. He chewed slowly, delicately, as if the ham carried not just flavor, but the texture of something sacred. Faith, being tested. Hope didn't cry, but her throat tightened. Her hand remained where it was, light as air, as though she had just passed along a promise. This wasn't a meal. It was a rite, a quiet pact between two souls, one willing to stay, the other still unsure if it had the right to exist. Rowan opened his eyes. He didn't speak. He looked at the scene, undramatic, hushed, almost mundane. An open hand, a vanished slice of ham, and a dog chewing in silence beneath flickering light. "You fed him?" he asked softly, as if a loud word might shatter the moment. Hope nodded, not looking back. Number he chose to take it. Rowan stayed quiet for a long time. Then he stood, picked up a blanket, and draped it gently over Hope's shoulders. His eyes no longer held suspicion, but the understanding of someone who had just realized that the greatest changes come not from declarations, but from the smallest of gestures. And in that moment, Patch had shown him something he once believed impossible, that even the most shattered soul, if given a choice, might still choose to come home. Hope remained seated until the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn threading through the slats of the curtain, bathing the rug in a soft golden hue where she and Patch sat together. Two silent figures suspended in the stillness of a new morning, where the battle between hunger and fear had no victor and no vanquished. Only a gentle, near imperceptible movement forward, slow but deliberate, enough to shift the weight of an entire world. Outside the window, sunlight dripped onto the porch roof like honey, thick and golden, infusing the air with the quiet warmth of a day not yet defined, as if the sky itself was waiting for Patch to open his eyes before it could truly begin. Hope rose to her feet, easing the stiffness from her neck after a night spent almost motionless, and gently pulled the edge of the blanket closer around Patch, who still lay curled in that in-between posture, caught somewhere between sleep and waking, breathing steady but eyes half open, like one too often roused from dreams to still believe in the safety of sleep. Rowan entered from the kitchen, a small bowl in his hands. Inside were slivers of poached chicken breast, carefully chopped and mixed with white rice and bone broth. The aroma drifted softly with his steps, not insistently, but with the hush of something remembered, something once known, like a far-off echo of care, of being named, of meals given not out of survival, but because of love. He sat down at a distance, just right, not close enough to overwhelm, not far enough to disengage. The bowl was placed on the floor without sound, no clatter, no coaxing gesture, only a presence, warm and steady and real. Patch shifted slightly. His ears lifted, then folded again, like doors unsure how to open inward. Rowan did not wait for a miracle. He understood that trust rarely arrives in a moment, but comes in pieces, through the gaze that doesn't flinch, the stillness that doesn't force, the silences that don't demand. He sat there with one hand resting on his thigh, palm open and angled toward Patch, not reaching, not touching, but simply there, like a patch of earth waiting for footsteps. Patch opened his eyes. Sunlight now flooded the floor, streaking it with gold like a welcome mat woven for a first step. He didn't rise right away. His body stayed curled, but his eyes no longer fully avoided. They searched, hesitated, not like a creature preparing to strike, but like a traveler long used to the traps hidden in the language of invitation. He looked at Rowan. Not blinking, not growling, not barking. Just looked. A gaze as long as a river running backward, touching memories Rowan could not see but could feel in the silence filling his chest. Rowan remained perfectly still. Even his breath was measured into round, quiet pulses, so Patch would not be startled, would not be jolted from the thin thread of thought he was following through the darkness. 1 minute passed. Then another. Patch shifted. One paw stretched forward, touching the rug as though testing whether the ground could truly hold him. Then came the second paw, and the gaunt frame slowly unfolded, not in a spasm of fear, but in the tentative lift of a past being momentarily set aside. He inched towards the bowl, not to eat, but to pause. Now the distance between him and Rowan was no longer measured in fear, but in the space a glance could travel without interruption. Rowan did not move, but gently tilted his head, his palm still facing Patch, fingers relaxed, undefined, as if to say, "I am here, only waiting for you to choose." And Patch, with a motion almost too small to catch, lowered his head. His nose touched Rowan's hand, not long enough to be a caress, not brief enough to be accidental. Just a moment. But in that moment, something inside Rowan's chest cracked open, not loudly, not violently, but like the first drop of rain falling into a desert after a season too long without. Rowan drew in a breath. His eyes held Patch's, and a smile curled on his lips, not one of triumph, not of overwhelming emotion, but the kind of smile a man makes when he sees something real, deeply, quietly real, after years spent adrift in noise. He didn't speak, didn't reach to stroke Patch's back, didn't try to hold on. He simply left his hand where it was, and allowed Patch to decide whether that space would ever be returned to. Patch lifted his head. His eyes still carried mist, but within that haze, Hope, standing now by the stove, her hands cradling a freshly brewed cup of coffee, saw a glint of light, as fragile as silk thread, yet glimmering like the first sunbeam of summer after a winter without end. "You see it?" she asked, voice catching. Rowan didn't turn but nodded softly. "I see it." The house itself seemed to exhale, as if even the walls were listening to something that had never happened before. A creature forged entirely in defense had chosen, even if just for a breath, to touch a human being, not as instinct, but as intention. And that choice, however fleeting, made this morning more meaningful than any bright day that had ever come before in their lives. Hope set her cup down and walked toward Rowan. She knelt beside him and slowly reached toward Patch. Her hand hovered for a second in the air, asking permission in silence. Patch looked at her, didn't flinch, didn't withdraw, just looked, then lowered his eyes. A silent nod, shaped only by trust. "We should bathe him," Hope whispered. "His fur is matted, covered in dirt, and there are small wounds. If left untreated, they could become worse." Rowan stayed quiet for a long moment. "Do you think he'll let us?" Hope exhaled softly, not answering right away. She stood and walked toward the bathroom, where sunlight filtered through the window onto the worn tiles like a frayed silver rug. She turned on the tap, adjusting the stream to a warmth just right, not too hot to burn, not too cold to shiver. In that small space, the sound of water trickling became a familiar melody, as if someone had once hummed it long ago in a memory Patch couldn't name, now returning without warning, without promise, yet carrying a softness that made you want to follow. Rowan, careful as breath, gently led Patch toward the bathroom. The fabric lead, soft as flannel, slipped around his neck. Not tight, not restraining, just resting, like a scarf someone might drape across a loved one's shoulders on a misted morning. Patch stepped forward, slowly, each movement like crossing an invisible threshold only he could see, a gate known not to the world, but to the history carved deep into his own skin. The moment his paw touched the tiled floor, his entire body froze. Ears perked high, eyes wide and unblinking, breath quick and ragged, his frame locked in place like a piece of driftwood plunged into ice. Hope sat down, facing him, not staring into the fear, but toward something more fragile, something hidden just beneath its shell. Her voice rose, not loud, not hushed, but just enough to still the air around them. "No one's here to hurt you," she said, like a story with no need for an ending. "It's just water, a little, just enough to wash the dirt away. You might feel lighter, like starting again." Patch didn't understand the words, but he understood the voice. He heard what storms, chains, and thunder had never been able to say, a kind of gentleness that asked for nothing in return. Rowan filled a small cup with warm water and poured it slowly down Patch's back. Not in haste, not with force. The stream slid gently over his fur, pulling with it not only caked-on dirt, but memories long left unwashed. Patch shivered. His body seemed to slip into a memory, one without image or sound. Only the phantom feeling of betrayal, a betrayal that had come once through water and human hands. His hind legs edged backward. From his throat came a low, broken noise. Not a growl, not a cry, but the breath of an old wound, remembering. Hope reached forward, laying her hand gently on his chest, not to press, not to hold, just a warm palm resting on tense skin. "You're safe now, Patch," she whispered. "You don't have to go back there. We're here. This is here." Rowan continued, letting the next trickle fall over the scar at Patch's neck. His eyes lingered for a moment, then turned away, as if he'd seen proof of a crime too cruel to name. His hands trembled slightly, but his movements remained steady. Minutes passed. Water gathered in the basin below, no longer falling over resistance. Patch stood still, tense, not relaxed, but no longer retreating. His ears stayed low, eyes wide, but his body had loosened from its frozen shell. Hope reached for a bottle of mild shampoo, working it gently into his back. Her hands moved slowly, as if sketching circles of healing into the water. "You're doing so well, Patch. You're being so brave," she said, her voice a soft melody not yet written. Rowan glanced over. His eyes met Hope's. No words passed between them. But Patch, even without language, was listening. Not with his ears, but with something buried in his chest. And in that fragile silence, the water was no longer meant to clean. It had become a rite, a small beginning. When it was over, Hope wrapped a towel around Patch. He didn't resist. He allowed it, breath slowing, eyes no longer straining wide. He didn't lean against anyone, but he also didn't pull away. "Do you see it?" Rowan whispered, watching Patch settle onto the soft blanket near the fire. Hope nodded, wiping a single drop of water from his nose. "I see it." And truly, something had shifted in those eyes. Not peace, not safety, not yet. But somewhere inside the gray of pain and caution, a small ring of light had begun to widen. Faint, thin, but real, like the first sunrise peeking through a keyhole after a door has stayed shut too long. Night fell like a heavy quilt, wrapping both house and unspoken things in its weight. Outside, the wind filtered through the pines, and the window pane shivered slightly, as if memory itself were gently knocking to be let back in. Inside the living room, the fireplace glowed low, its orange flame breathing softly with the crackle of aging wood, like the heartbeat of a space learning how to welcome a new soul. Hope drew the thin curtains closed, not to shut out the dark, but to keep it from swallowing everything whole. She laid an extra blanket beside Patch and placed a pillow next to him. Not to be used, but to make it feel like someone might sit there, should he open his eyes in the middle of the night. She kissed the top of his head, a touch without sound, heavy as a promise never to abandon, and then stepped away, leaving the hush of the room to hold the sleep that Patch had never truly known. Rowan stayed behind. He wasn't sure why. Only that his feet wouldn't leave, the fire hadn't dimmed, and something unnamed inside him hadn't settled. He watched Patch, now dry, curled into a small shape within the wide room, and let out a breath, as if even a louder exhale might disturb something fragile still hovering in the air. Time passed, suspended in a waiting that expected nothing and everything at once, like winter frost reluctant to let go of the earth. Then, near midnight, just as the clock's hand slipped past 12 and the world outside seemed to still in collective breath, Patch stirred. At first, just a tremor, then a soft whimper, almost silent. Then, suddenly, as if some tide had broken loose in the depths of his soul, Patch jolted upright and howled, a long, cracked, uneven sound, like the cry of an old wolf mourning his lost pack beneath a final winter moon. Rowan shot up, not in fear, but in recognition. That sound, the one no one teaches, the one no heart can fake, hit his chest like a blow that needed no force. He rushed to Patch's side, dropping down fast but without alarm, extending a hand, not to touch, but to anchor, a presence in the storm of memory. Patch trembled violently. His hind legs curled inward, his jaw hung open with no voice left, only gasps, sharp and staggered, like a panic trying to claw its way out. His eyes were wide, but they weren't seeing the room. They were staring straight through time, into everything that had come before. As if he were still chained, still beaten, still locked in the dark. As if no one had told him yet that he'd made it out. Rowan didn't speak at first. He simply sat there, close enough that, should Patch collapse, he could catch him, far enough that, if Patch needed space, he would not feel cornered. And only when Patch's breathing began to slow, not quite steady, but less broken, did Rowan finally speak, his voice a hushed murmur, like someone whispering to a child who no longer believed in voices. "No one will hurt you here. No more chains, no more dark, no more nights where no one comes." Patch didn't respond, but his body no longer flinched. His eyes remained open, still lost, still wary, but beginning to find some fragile tether in the voice that kept rising gently beside him. Rowan pulled a small blanket over his frame, adjusted the pillow closer, and then sat still. He did not return to the bedroom. He did not lie on the couch. He just stayed, silent but fully present. Hope woke before the light had fully broken. She stepped into the living room, and the first thing she saw was Rowan, seated against the wall, arms folded over his legs, head bowed slightly, eyes still open. And Patch, pressed gently against him, not because he had been pulled closer, but because he had moved himself there. She sat down beside them, not speaking for a long, quiet stretch. "You stayed up all night?" she asked, not in reprimand, not in concern, but as a gentle acknowledgement that she noticed. Rowan nodded. "He was dreaming. Probably about things you wouldn't want to know, but I could feel them." Hope looked at Patch, asleep again now, but with a softness to him, a release, a kind of letting go she hadn't seen before. She whispered, "I once lost someone, when I was too young to understand that absence could be permanent. And back then, I stared into the mirror for days, not to study my face, but to understand why my eyes no longer looked the same. Patch's eyes, they look exactly like mine did." Rowan turned toward her, and the space between them was no longer measured in inches or feet, but in a kind of empathy formed only through the witnessing of pain too deep for language, yet still capable of being shared. Hope placed her hand on Rowan's back, not to comfort, but as if to say, "You did it." And Patch, in the fragility of sleep, exhaled a long breath, like a ghost finally stepping free from memory. The next morning, sunlight slipped gently through the kitchen window, catching the motes of dust still hanging in the air, casting a new skin over the house. Lighter, more breathable, and quietly preparing for a day none of them knew would be etched deeper into memory than any day that had come before. Rowan prepared the car while Hope gathered a soft towel, a light blanket, and a makeshift collar fashioned from a loosely tied strip of cloth, everything they needed to take Patch to the vet. She didn't explain the reason to Patch. She simply sat beside him, stroked his back, and spoke in a voice she hadn't known existed in her, a voice that belonged not to ownership, but to reverence. "We'll just go for a little while, only to see what your body's been trying to say, because your heart, I think, has already started whispering." Patch didn't resist, and he didn't volunteer. He let Hope guide him gently toward the car, climbing into the back seat with Rowan's help. Not quickly, not effortlessly, but without the trembling from that first time. The car rolled forward down the suburban road, cutting through tall grass and under a sky so clear it seemed incapable of carrying any shadow. The veterinary clinic was small, nestled within a cluster of trees. The vet was an older woman, her eyes calm in the way of someone who had seen enough to know that certain wounds should never be questioned too soon. She crouched down, did not reach to touch Patch, only opened her palm, as Hope once had, and said quietly, "There's no hurry. I have time." Patch remained still. His gaze did not retreat, nor did it reach forward. It simply held, fixed on a distant point where trust had not yet arrived, but fear had finally begun to recede. The vet gently took a warm cloth and wiped around Patch's neck, inspecting the skin beneath fur that hadn't fully grown back. She inhaled slowly, not in surprise, not in shock, but with the sorrowful certainty of someone long familiar with the marks that abandonment leaves behind. "Here," she pointed. "There's a ring-shaped scar around the neck. Thin, long, deeply pressed. Not leather. This is from barbed wire, or steel, twisted tight for far too long." Hope sat frozen. Rowan dropped his gaze, fingers curling around the edge of the chair. "And here," the vet continued, gesturing toward Patch's front legs, "the joints are calloused with signs of old inflammation. He may have been restrained in a kneeling position. The skin around the paws is thickened. This tells me he stood for hours, maybe days, on cold concrete. No padding, no movement, not a few days. Months, possibly longer." Hope turned her face away, eyes brimming but tears not yet fallen. Not because of the details themselves, but because of everything unsaid. The nights Patch had endured, the cries no one answered, the hunger that went unseen, and the desperate scratches on wooden doors and metal fences until claws bled. The vet examined his back, his belly, his teeth, every part confirming the same truth: prolonged malnourishment, no sign of grooming, no record of veterinary care. And perhaps most revealing of all, no chip, no collar, nothing to show that Patch had ever been called by any name before Hope had spoken those 2 syllables. "Patch is still capable of recovery," the vet said at last. His liver is intact, his heartbeat steady, his eyes are still clear. But time has already taken far too much. What he needs now isn't medicine, it's patience. Steady, enduring patience like light waiting for the sun to rise. Hope nodded, her hands wrapping gently around Patch's paw, squeezing softly, as though trying to catch every piece of him still slipping through the cracks of time. "How much time does he have left?" Rowan asked, his voice rasping. Not from illness, but from the weight of something he wasn't yet ready to let fall from his throat. "Quite a while," the doctor replied, "if every day from now on is lived as a real day." On the drive home, no one spoke. Patch sat still on the blanket, his eyes closed. Not in sleep, but in thought, as though searching for something deeper than fatigue. And when they pulled into the driveway, when Hope opened the car door, Patch didn't wait to be led. He jumped down on his own, not gracefully but firmly, not fast but with purpose. Hope watched him. Her heart in that moment grew by one more piece, a fragment that had never quite found its place until now, until it finally knew where it belonged. Because sometimes the oldest scars don't live on the skin. They hide in the eyes, in the breath, in the kind of silence where even the gentlest touch can unravel someone. And Patch, a body marked by time and memory, was slowly reclaiming the one thing that hadn't yet been taken, his right to feel, to be held, to be touched, and to be called by name. Not as a thing, but as someone. That morning unfolded with a calm so complete, it felt as if every storm had been folded into yesterday, leaving behind a skylight as silk stretched across the roof tiles. Patch lay on the porch, head resting on Hope's leg, eyes half closed in rhythm with the late-season wind teasing through the lavender garden. Rowan washed the car beneath the tree's shade, unhurried, relaxed, as if the universe had finally begun to settle into its rightful pace. Then, from a distance, the unfamiliar hum of an engine stirred the air. Not loud, but different enough to throw off the balance of things. Patch lifted his head. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he simply froze. The way his body locked into perfect stillness made Hope's breath catch. Dogs don't react like that to strangers. Patch wasn't surprised. Patch remembered. The small truck stopped outside the gate. A man stepped down. Lean, ball cap pulled low, sleeves rolled up on a sun-worn shirt, eyes scanning the yard like he was counting the gravel. When his gaze met Patch's, it tightened into a smile. Not the warm curl of reunion, but the kind of grin that made the skin crawl for how wrong it was in the moment. "That dog," the man said, voice rough like rotted wood. "His name's Rex. He's mine." Hope rose, hand gently pulling Patch closer, but Patch had already stood, backpedaling 3 steps before a deep, guttural growl ripped from his chest. Not a bark. A rupture. A memory yanked to the surface. His eyes widened, ears flattened, body stiffened like stone. His legs trembled, but he held his ground, torn between defending, fleeing, and bracing for pain. "You're mistaken," Rowan said, stepping from the shade. His voice dropped low, like thunder before it breaks. "This dog belongs to no one." The man gave a short laugh and took a step forward. "I lost him over 4 months ago. He ran from the yard. He's got a scar on his neck, doesn't he? That's from the wire. I tied it tight so he wouldn't slip it. Didn't expect him to be dumb enough to tear through his own skin." Hope could barely breathe hearing those words. Patch had begun to retreat again, his back legs hitting the edge of the porch, whole body shaking violently, mouth open and gasping for air that wouldn't come. "You said, yard?" Rowan repeated, face still, but his eyes had changed. "Yeah, guard dog yard. Took him in as a pup. Fed him, trained him. Just when he was getting useful, he ran. You have any idea what it costs to raise one of these things?" Patch let out another growl, louder now, raw, echoing from the scarred hollow of his throat like a cry he had never been allowed to make. Hope dropped to her knees, hand pressed over his chest, feeling the heart pounding like war drums behind a ribcage carved by fear. "We're not giving him back," Rowan said. Each word landed heavy, forged from steel. The man snorted. "He's mine. I've got his vaccination records, photos. You've got no legal right to keep him." Hope stood. She didn't yell. She didn't raise her hand. She just looked at him. Direct, unshaking, the kind of look born from places where love had once been stolen and never returned. The kind of look that needed no explanation. "If you were his owner, why didn't you look for him? Why didn't you report he was missing? Why didn't you ask, 'Is he okay?' before you tried to take him back?" He hesitated, just long enough to reveal everything that mattered. He didn't care. He hadn't come for a companion. He had come for property. Rowan stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the dog. "Not everyone deserves a dog," he said, voice low, "and you never deserved this one." Patch didn't bark again. He sat, still watchful, but no longer shaking. He leaned forward slightly and touched his nose to Hope's leg. A small gesture, barely a second long, but to her, it was an answer. The man looked at the three of them, smirked, then turned and walked back to his truck. "We'll see each other again," he muttered. "I'll come back, with a lawyer." Rowan didn't answer. Hope didn't move. And Patch didn't look away from the truck as it reversed from the gate. Not until the sound of the engine disappeared beyond the trees did the house begin to breathe again. Hope knelt, arms wrapping Patch close. "You chose us," she whispered, "and we won't let anyone take you away again." Rowan stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder. Not as comfort, but as vow. Not everyone deserves a dog, because dogs, if given a chance, will give you everything. But if they're betrayed, the look in their eyes may never be whole again. Patch didn't need to look back. He had already crossed a piece of the past. And this time there was someone standing, quietly and firmly, between him and everything that had ever tried to break him. The next morning, before sunlight had a chance to cut through the veil of mist still hanging in folds of gray across the sky, Hope led Patch out into the yard. No leash, no commands, only a collar made of soft cloth, and the sound of bare feet brushing gently across gravel. Rowan followed behind, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, one hand buried deep in his coat pocket, the cool breeze tousling his hair like the long breath of a land that had just emerged from a season of stillness. "We'll just take a walk," Hope said softly, as if not to disturb the quiet that had settled over everything like a hush laid by something sacred. Patch turned to look at her, then back toward the open gate. There were no car horns, no voices calling, only the dry rustle of fallen leaves beneath their steps, and the filtered sunlight casting golden webs through the thinning canopy of autumn trees. For the first time, Patch stepped beyond the yard. He didn't lower his head, didn't tense his spine. He simply walked, slowly, each step deliberate, as though every footfall was a test of whether the ground truly welcomed his weight. Hope did not pull. Rowan did not nudge. They simply walked alongside, maintaining a space wide enough for Patch to feel free, yet close enough that he never had to feel alone. The red dirt path wound behind the hill, where tall ferns swayed like green chandeliers, and clusters of feathergrass whispered softly in the wind. Each time Patch paused, Hope stopped. Each time he turned his head to glance back, she smiled, not to prompt him forward, but to affirm a simple truth. "I'm still here." The distance between Patch and the 2 humans no longer stretched like a line of suspicion. It had become a corridor of choice. He no longer clung to the edges of walls, no longer ducked beneath fences as if terrified of being pulled back into the dark spaces once labeled kennel. He still walked behind, but his eyes no longer flicked back and forth in panic, no longer flinched at the sound of wind. His steps, still cautious, had grown straighter, no longer bent in avoidance of his own shadow. When the three of them reached the small rise that opened out to the valley below, Rowan stopped. He sat on a wide, weather-worn stone beside the path, set his cup down, and touched Hope lightly on the shoulder. Hope turned to Patch and patted the mossy ground beside her. "Do you want to sit with us?" Patch halted. He didn't respond right away, but neither did he retreat. A breath, a glance. And then, as if he had weighed something quietly and found it safe, he stepped forward, placed his paws carefully on the damp stone, and settled beside Hope, not leaning in, not touching, but close. Close enough to feel the warmth of skin that did not carry harm. The wind slid softly through the trees. A shaft of sunlight filtered through the branches and fell across Hope's shoulder, as though the sky itself had chosen this exact moment to be framed and remembered. She tilted her head and looked at Patch, her gaze as gentle as a lullaby. "If you choose to stay," she said, each word carefully shaped from the very center of her chest, "then this is home." Patch didn't nod. He didn't wag his tail, but he turned his face toward the valley, toward the open sky, the wind, the long shadows of Hope and Rowan stretching beside him, and he stayed. No sign of agreement, no grand gesture, just presence, full, voluntary, and no longer trembling. And sometimes, in the world of creatures who have known betrayal too well, to remain is the most sacred covenant, a recognition that asks for no paper, no sound, only the truth of choosing not to run. Hope reached out and laid her hand lightly across Patch's back. Not for comfort, but because she now knew with certainty none of the three were alone anymore. Rowan watched, his fingers tightening softly around the coffee cup, as if trying to hold on to that warmth for the days still waiting to unfold. The days that followed passed with the quiet rhythm of a life beginning to accept itself. A life in which Patch no longer pressed into corners when someone stood up. A life in which Hope could stir a pot on the stove and hear the gentle tap of claws behind her on the tile without flinching at the silence. Rowan began leaving the door open while he worked, and Patch, instead of vanishing, often lay just a few paces away, his eyes half closed, breath even, like a companion who didn't need words to feel close. Then came the rain, unannounced, uninvited. The sky turned leaden in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon, as though someone had drawn a heavy curtain of sorrow over the world. The wind rose, carrying the scent of damp grass and the sound of leaves skittering across the roof like hurried footsteps in a language no one had spoken in years. Thunder cracked, not violently, but deep enough to stir the floor beneath them. And in that first moment, Patch jolted upright. His body coiled like a bow pulled too tight, eyes wide, ears flattened against his skull, claws scraping against the wooden floor in a desperate attempt to retreat from a nightmare that had returned without warning. He did not howl. He did not whimper. He only breathed in short, rapid bursts, as though the air had been sucked from the room and he was trapped beneath the surface of something shapeless and cruel. Hope had just stepped out of the kitchen when she saw him. Her eyes locked with his, a look brimming with raw panic, the kind that needed no explanation, no naming. It was a reflex, the pure reaction of a creature who had spent too many nights learning that every loud sound might be followed by pain. "Patch," she whispered, not moving forward, not reaching out. She simply stood, still, quiet, offering the only safety that mattered in that moment, presence without intrusion. Patch bolted for the corner of the room, toward the old wooden wardrobe left slightly ajar, the one space untouched by yellow lamplight. He crawled inside, pressing his body against the wall, tucking his head between two wool sweaters Hope had hung there at the start of the season, and stopped moving. Hope didn't follow. She pulled a small wooden chair near the wardrobe door and sat down. Outside, the rain battered the windows in a relentless, arrhythmic symphony, loud, uninvited, and unyielding. But inside, time slowed, to the rhythm of Hope's quiet breathing, to the tiny tremors that passed through Patch's frame, to the unspoken minutes marked only by the steady beating of hearts. She didn't speak. She didn't soothe. She simply sat, back straight, hands resting lightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the shadowed outline of a dog curled into a silent shape just behind the wardrobe door. And through every clap of thunder, through each gust of wind howling past the windows like forgotten cries, it was the silence that remained. The one thread of connection Patch needed most. No demands, no pity, no effort to intrude. Just someone who stayed, quietly, without leaving. Half an hour passed, then a full hour. The rain didn't let up. Rowan walked by the door, paused for a moment, gave the faintest nod, and stepped back inside, no questions, no interference, as if he knew that between Hope and Patch, there was a kind of conversation no human language could enter. And then, nearly 2 hours in, Hope noticed the smallest shift. Patch turned his head. Not fully, not to face the world, but no longer pressed against the back of the cabinet. His ears twitched, his breathing slowed. He lifted his head just slightly, resting it on his front paws, as if testing whether the world outside was still something to hide from. Hope tilted her head, eyes steady on the shadows. She didn't smile, didn't whisper, "Good job," didn't say, "You're okay now." She simply held her posture, becoming the stillness that someone once broken might one day return to. And then, for the first time since the rain began, Patch stretched out his legs. Not out of the cabinet, but just enough for his spine to loosen. Enough for Hope's blink to delay by a single beat. Because what she saw wasn't a reflex. It was a first step. The beginning of learning that not every sound means threat, not every rain carries violence. That night, the rain went on. But inside the cabinet, Patch drifted into sleep, his head still resting on Hope's old flannel shirt, his body no longer pressed into the farthest edge. And outside, Hope leaned against the wall, eyes closed. She didn't know when she'd dozed off, only that by dawn, when she woke, the rain had stopped, Patch was still there, and the distance between them had narrowed to the span of a single breath. That morning was overcast, a light mist hugging the long grass near the western ridge, where Rowan often surveyed the local plant life for his ecological mapping project. Lately, he'd started bringing Patch, not for protection, but because he'd come to understand something. Patch's quiet presence, measured, loyal, unshakable, was like a shadow with a soul, always walking a few steps behind, but never letting him drift from view. Hope packed the food, placed it in Rowan's backpack alongside a bottle of water and a small first aid kit. Before he left, she bent down, tied the soft cloth harness back around Patch's chest, and whispered a promise that carried the weight of something more than words. "You keep the fire, okay? Don't let it go out." Rowan chuckled. "I'm the one holding the lighter." Hope shook her head. "I wasn't talking about that fire." The forest loomed dark, but not frightening, if you weren't alone. Patch walked to Rowan's right, ears alert, glancing back from time to time. Rowan didn't call out, didn't direct, but he noticed, today, for the first time, Patch avoided the decaying stumps on his own, chose firmer ground crossing the stream, every step quiet but intentional, A stretch of trail had collapsed from recent rain, cutting off the planned route. Rowan veered onto a new path, a soft bank where tall grass veiled the edge. He stepped forward, eyes on the map. Patch moved ahead slightly, his body lowering, nose testing something unseen. Rowan didn't notice. And then, just 2 steps later, the ground beneath him gave way like a rug pulled from underneath. His body dropped, balance gone. No chance to grab hold, just a short yell and the reflex to release his gear. But he didn't hit the ground. Something held him. A sharp, pulling force, not from a harness, not from equipment, but from above, where Patch had his jaws clamped tightly around the thick sleeve of Rowan's jacket, his body stretched, front paws digging into earth, hind legs sliding across wet moss. In that moment, they hovered between gravity and will. 1 man, 3 times the weight, and a dog with a body never fully healed, bound together by a thread no wider than the final stitch between 2 broken worlds. Patch growled, not in anger, but like he was calling out something buried deep within himself, the instinct to protect. And Rowan, hands now clinging to a root near the slope's edge, eyes wide, thought of nothing except trusting entirely in the creature above, the one holding him at the threshold between falling and surviving. Seconds passed, or maybe centuries, inside breaths that came jagged and quick. Then the ground steadied. Rowan gripped the root. Patch let go but didn't move back. He leapt down along the side, barked twice, sharp, direct, as if to say, "Come around this way." Rowan climbed out from the lower ledge, hands muddy, sweat soaking his collar. He collapsed to the earth, panting, then looked at Patch. The dog sat just an arm's length away, coat damp, tongue out from exhaustion. But his gaze, for the first time, it didn't speak of trauma. It looked like that of a teammate who had simply done what needed to be done. Rowan nodded, slowly placing his hand on Patch's head. The dog didn't flinch. "Well done," he whispered. "So well done." No one said anything more. Back at the house, Hope opened the door. The moment she saw them, mud-caked man, panting dog, she rushed forward. But Rowan raised a hand. "It's okay," he said. "Thanks to Patch." Hope turned to look at Patch. He lay stretched out on the wooden floor, eyes gently closed, not out of exhaustion, but like a fire that had burned through a turbulent wind and now, for a while, had chosen to rest. That night, for the first time, Rowan picked up the cushion usually kept beside the sofa and laid it down near the fireplace. Not for Patch, but next to him. And beneath the flickering amber glow of the flames, the 3 of them simply sat. No conversation, no soundtrack, no obligatory gratitude. Because trust, when offered in silence, does not need to be named to be real. Patch fell asleep first. His head rested across Rowan's leg. Rowan didn't move it away. The next morning, sunlight poured softly through the small window beside the dining table, falling in long slants across the honey-stained floorboards. Hope was rinsing a few apples in a bowl of cold water, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back. Even the simplest gestures of the morning seemed to carry a new layer of light after the night they had just passed. Patch lay under the table, eyes half closed, unmoving as Rowan walked past him. He did not growl, did not shift nervously. He only inched slightly toward the beam of sun, as if trying to warm the pieces of memory still clinging to the uneven fur along his back. In that hush of a morning still finding its rhythm, the wind chime on the porch suddenly tinkled, not from wind, but from the touch of a small hand. Then came a voice, soft and slightly hesitant with the unmistakable rhythm of childhood. "Miss Hope, can I bring over some cookies?" Hope dried her hands and opened the door. Standing there was Emily, the little girl from the house 3 doors down, who had only recently moved into the neighborhood. She was about 6, with curly hair tied in two uneven pigtails, holding a tray of cookies wrapped in a napkin shaped like a heart. Her face lit up in the sunlight, but her eyes wavered, uncertain, when they landed on the shape of Patch lying near the door. "Thank you, sweetheart," Hope smiled, crouching down. "Did you make them?" "Well, my mom baked them," Emily replied shyly. "But I sprinkled the sugar." Patch didn't move. He only opened his eyes, watching. No growl, no retreat. Hope looked at him, then over to Rowan. He gave a small nod. "Would you like to say hi to Patch?" Hope asked, her voice as soft as the woolen blanket she often pulled over him on colder nights. Emily nodded, though her feet stayed planted. Hope sat down, set the tray to one side, and gently tapped the rug just outside the doorway. "Patch, come here." Patch lifted his head. His ears perked. There was nothing compelling him forward, no treats, no commands, only a gentle gaze and a voice that carried something that felt strikingly close to trust. And Patch stepped forward. Not quickly, not too near, but far enough for the light to catch his fur and make visible a delicate movement near the base of his spine. His tail, which once curled so tightly between his legs, now beginning to sway, gently, tentatively, but truly. Hope froze for a moment. Rowan, standing by the window, didn't move. The tail, like a small forgotten flag fluttering for the first time in years beneath layers of fear and silence, began to wave, slow and unsure, in sync with the steps of a child who was now kneeling, hand outstretched, toward a dog, no longer a ghost. Patch lowered his head. He didn't nuzzle, but he didn't flinch either. And then, with a movement as faint as a thought not yet spoken, he touched his nose to her small palm, as if offering something long held, something no one had dared to reach for until now. Emily giggled. "He's warm, Miss Hope." Hope didn't reply. She covered her mouth. Tears spilled over, not from simple emotion, but because in that fleeting moment, something broken deep inside her had been mended, not with words, but with the quiet grace of a moment disguised as ordinary, yet carrying the weight of a miracle. Rowan placed a hand on her shoulder, and it trembled slightly. "You see it?" he whispered, as if afraid to fracture the fragile now. "He knows how to wag his tail?" Patch stayed there, tail still swaying. No command, no reward, not instinct. But because he wanted to. That afternoon, after Emily had gone home, Rowan sat outside sketching the unfinished map of the woods behind their house. Hope brought out 2 cups of tea, placing one beside him, the other beside Patch, who was lying beneath the eaves, head lifting gently as she approached. "We didn't teach him that," Hope said. Rowan nodded. "Because he didn't need to learn, only to remember." Hope looked out into the trees, her voice a quiet drift carried by the breeze. "It's strange how a tail wag can make you feel like you belong somewhere." Patch didn't understand, but he laid his head on Hope's leg, and his tail moved again. The sky the next morning was a deep, quiet blue, but within Rowan stirred something else, not loud, but persistent, like the tap of glass against glass. Unease. He couldn't name it, not right away, until the phone buzzed in his coat pocket. A message from the woman at the end of the street, Caroline, the neighbor who had installed a security camera outside her porch to keep an eye on her orchids. "Rowan, I think I found something about your dog. From early summer, I was reviewing old camera footage because my bike went missing, and I came across this." Attached was a video, barely 2 minutes long. He opened it. Hope was in the kitchen, washing a glass. Patch was asleep behind the sofa, unaware that a part of his past was about to arrive through a screen smaller than Rowan's hand. The footage was angled toward the alley behind Caroline's house, where wild grass pushed through stones and trash sometimes gathered unnoticed in the night. It had been a sunny day. The sunlight flared in the frame, and then a small figure appeared. Not a man, not an adult, a boy. Thin. His back bent as if carrying something far heavier than a child should ever bear. In his hand, a leash. At the end of that leash, Patch, thin, matted, moving as if every step had come at the end of a road with no map and no promise. The boy stood still in the alley. He looked around, then bent low and whispered something to Patch's ear. The audio couldn't catch it. But when he stood up, eyes red, he yanked the leash and tied it tightly to a rusted lamppost. Patch didn't resist. He didn't bark. He didn't pull. He only stood there, watching. The boy turned away, walked 3 steps, then stopped, turned back, bit his lip, placed a hand on his chest like someone trying to hold in a piece of themselves too torn to name, and then ran. The video flared white with sunlight, the lens catching too much sky. But it was enough. Enough for Rowan to grip the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. "Hope?" he called. His voice came from somewhere distant, no longer anchored in his chest. "You should see this." She walked over, watched the screen, all the way to the end. She said nothing. Patch was still asleep. Rowan shot to his feet. "I'm sending this video to the authorities. Whoever that boy is, this is abuse. Patch deserves protection." Hope remained where she was. No nod, no shake of the head. Just a question, quiet and steady. "Did you see his face?" Rowan froze. Hope continued. "A child, hunched over from fear, eyes red from crying, hands trembling as he tied the rope, and Patch wasn't afraid of him." "Because Patch didn't know to be afraid," Rowan said. Hope shook her head. For the first time. Number Patch knew he wasn't a bad person, just a kid who didn't have a choice. That night, Hope traced the footage, tracking a grainy snippet from a camera across from the local market just a few blocks away. From there, they found the address, not through police, not through a shelter, but simply by asking newspaper vendors, scrap collectors, and those invisible to most, yet able to see everything no one else noticed. It was the last house in a narrow alley, gray walls, door hanging loose from rusted hinges. A woman answered, sunken face, voice brittle like dry leaves. "He's my nephew," she said. "Father's gone, mother's in rehab. He skips school all the time, dragging that mutt around. I told him to get rid of it. We don't keep dogs here." Hope and Rowan exchanged a look. No further questions. The boy's name was Jude, 12 years old. He had been temporarily placed at a juvenile support center. 2 days later, Hope left Patch sitting in the car, door open as they entered the facility. Jude sat alone in the garden corner, arms wrapped around his knees, long hair nearly covering his eyes. Hope sat beside him, silent. Rowan kept his distance. It was Jude who spoke first. "I didn't want to leave him." Hope nodded gently. I didn't know if he was alive. I thought maybe he hated me." Hope tightened her hand. "Number, he doesn't hate you." Jude looked up. "You're sure?" "There are things a dog will never do unless it believes it's still loved." Patch wagged his tail for the first time, for a child. That child was you. All it takes is returning, at the right moment. They didn't bring Patch in. But when they stepped outside, Patch was already there. Sitting, not barking, not moving, just watching Jude. And again, the tail moved, not fast, not hard, but enough to break the dam inside Jude. He broke down, Rowan knelt beside him, hand resting gently on his shoulder. You did the right thing. Even with your heart being pulled apart, you still chose not to hurt. The air that day held a gentle chill, and sunlight slipped across the windows like an old memory, quiet and pale. Hope placed a small wooden chair beneath the cherry tree in the backyard, where the sun still filtered through just enough to kiss the grass, where Patch liked to lie still each morning, listening to birdsong. She set out 2 more chairs, one for Jude, one for Rowan, not as a stage, but as a space, open, waiting, safe for things too tender to be spoken. The gate creaked open. Jude stepped in, fingers clenched tight around his backpack straps, eyes cast downward. Rowan met him halfway, hand to his shoulder. No words, just a path made slower by footsteps meant to wait. Patch was already there, on the lawn, sunlight threading through branches and falling soft across his back. No leash, no command, just the stillness of waiting, without pressure, without judgment. Jude stopped several steps away. He didn't move. Hope gave a small nod. Sit if you want. There's no rush. Half an hour passed. Nothing but the sound of wind and wind alone. Jude hadn't spoken. Patch hadn't approached. But he hadn't left either. Then, as if something shifted quietly from inside, Jude set down his bag. He lowered himself to the grass, shoulders folding in. His voice came rough, torn from a chest where shame had been buried too long. I'm sorry. No one spoke. Rowan stilled. Hope turned away. That day, I didn't know what else to do, Jude continued, fists clenched on his knees. She kept yelling. Grown-ups kept saying dogs only bring trouble, that they're useless, always in the way. But I knew Patch understood me. His words crumbled into silence. Tears slid down his cheeks, not loud, not forced, but deep enough to carry everything he'd never said aloud. I wasn't trying to get rid of him. I just didn't know any other way. Patch rose slowly, not with speed, not with force. He walked step by step as if feeling his way across layers of memory laid beneath his paws. The wind rippled gently through his fur, and when he stopped in front of Jude, the light caught his eyes like a sliver of sun slipping through a window long closed. He sat down. He didn't bury his head in Jude's lap. He didn't lick his face. He didn't bark. He simply sat. Like the first time Hope had seen him in the back seat of the car, except this time Patch had chosen to come closer. Jude looked up, his eyes stretched wide between 2 trembling poles, the hope of being welcomed and the fear of being turned away. His hand reached out, barely grazing Patch's back before instinct pulled it away again. Patch didn't recoil. He tilted his head. Then, with a movement so slow it felt carved from an ancient wound, he placed his nose gently into the center of Jude's palm. No words were spoken. Only the breath of 2 beings once pulled apart by circumstances, now finding each other again, not through explanations, but through a language called forgiveness. Not the erasure of what had been, but the quiet acceptance that it no longer needed to hurt. Hope turned, her eyes red. Rowan stepped forward and rested a hand on Jude's shoulder, and this time the boy didn't flinch. Rowan spoke softly, each word carefully chosen as if weighed in the palm before being spoken aloud. You don't need to undo what happened. You only need to continue in a different way. Jude nodded. Patch remained seated. His tail swayed. When the sun tilted behind the crest of the hill, Jude stood and ran his hand gently along Patch's back, this time without hesitation. Patch didn't lie down. He stood alongside him, as if wanting to walk Jude part of the way home. "Can I come back? To visit him sometimes?" Jude asked. Hope smiled. "This gate's never locked." And Rowan added, "But if one day you want to take Patch for a walk, you'll have to ask him, not us." Jude crouched slightly. "Patch, would you give me another chance?" Patch lifted his head, his eyes catching the last light of the sun, and his tail, once again, swayed. Not quickly, not desperately, but enough to make the whole world soften in that one suspended moment. Because some forgiveness doesn't require words. Because some memories, though they never disappear, can be stepped over with trust. From that afternoon on, in the small house tucked at the edge of town where tall trees welcomed the morning sun and birdsong slipped quietly through the window cracks, something changed. Not loudly, not obviously, but clearly, like the way spring arrives without needing to wake anyone. Patch began choosing to sleep in the center of the living room, where the first light of day could reach the pillows, the rug, the hem of the sheer curtains Hope always left slightly drawn. He no longer tucked himself into the shadows by the wardrobe, no longer pressed tightly against walls. He stretched out fully, body relaxed, his head resting on Rowan's leg whenever he sat reading in the armchair. Every time Hope stepped out of the kitchen, Patch looked up, not out of fear of being left behind, but simply to know where she was going. One morning, before Hope had even reached for her coat, Patch was already standing at the door, looking up, tail gently wagging, as if asking a question he'd never dared to ask before. "Can we go for a walk together today?" Hope bent down, not answering with words but by slipping her feet into her soft boots and fastening the cloth collar loosely around Patch's neck. Patch didn't pull away. As they stepped outside, the cool air of December filtered through the trees, brushing beads of dew onto Rowan's shoulders as he waited on the porch. Patch walked between them, not pulling, not rushing, just walking, each step deliberate, like someone who had chosen to stay and was now rewriting the beginning of his story with steady, unhurried strides. They passed the small hill where Emily rode her bike, wandered past the quiet corner of the marketplace, then circled back along a gravel path soaked in the amber light of late afternoon. No one said much, but everything was enough. That evening, Rowan sat at his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. He flipped through the pages, applications, agreements, and the adoption form for pets in the district. It had been there since the first week. Not because he lacked resolve, but because he wanted to be certain that this journey was a mutual choice. Hope placed a cup of tea beside him, leaned in gently. "Have you made up your mind?" Rowan didn't answer right away. He leaned over and wrote his name in the upper left corner of the form. Each letter steady, upright, unrushed. "Not because Patch was good today," he said, "or because he's learned how to trust. But because I realized I can't picture this house without him anymore." Hope looked down at Patch, lying beneath the table, eyes closed, breathing soft and even. She smiled. "Then I'll fill in the part that says second contact." The day they arrived at the rescue center to officially complete the adoption papers, Patch walked beside them. No leash, no muzzle, no pressure. He stayed close to Hope, ears high, tail swaying in a soft rhythm. The intake officer, a silver-haired woman with warm eyes, watched him for a long moment, then smiled gently and said, "He looks like he knows this matters." Rowan nodded. "He always knows." Hope placed her hand on Patch's head. Not a stroke, not a pet, but something closer to a signature written in touch. He chose us before we ever chose him. The papers were signed, the stamp pressed against the page with a faint click, yet in Hope's heart it echoed like the unlocking of an old door, behind which waited a soul long forgotten, yearning to be called by name again. That evening they made a small meal. No party, no cake, just candlelight, a dish for humans, and a dish for one dog placed side by side. Patch ate slowly, not out of fear, but because there was no need to hurry. Here, nothing was taken. Here, everything belonged, not just the food, but the right to stay, to breathe, to belong. Rowan raised his glass. To Patch, the one who broke down the last wall in our hearts. Hope lifted hers. And to the one who showed us that sometimes trust doesn't begin with logic, but with the way someone chooses to stay, quietly, patiently, without needing a reason. Patch lay under the table, head resting on the quilt Hope had sewn by hand. The firelight cast his silhouette onto the wall, not curled in fear, but stretched in peace, the shape of a being sleeping in the safety of light. And when the house finally fell into silence, there was the soft thump of a tail, a good night wish that needed no translation. The following weekend, the town held its annual Rescue Dog Day, a celebration in the Central Park where once forgotten souls were called by name, not for the heroic things they'd done, but for the simple, profound fact that they had survived and learned to love again. Hope received an invitation from the local veterinary community. The sender was Dr. Mallory, the one who'd first examined Patch. In the note, she wrote that Patch's presence would mean a great deal, as his story, shared online from Caroline's original video, had touched many hearts. People need to know, Mallory wrote, that wounds don't block the light. They simply create places where light can enter. That Sunday morning, Patch was brushed gently, his ears cleaned, his nails trimmed. Rowan carefully tied around his neck a silvery gray scarf Hope had sewn, embroidered with one word: stay. It's not a command, Hope said. It's a reminder that staying isn't an obligation. It's something worth choosing. The park was filled with sunshine and laughter. Over 20 dogs had gathered, some with only one eye, others missing a limb, some thin as twigs yet wagging with wild joy. Each had a human, each had a story, and none of their eyes held fear anymore. They were living their second lives, where no one demanded perfection, only presence. Patch stepped through the park gates, not trembling. He walked through the crowd, eyes observing, ears alert, not out of anxiety, but because he was truly there. Rowan held the leash, loose and light, as if they were simply strolling through their own backyard. Hope walked beside them, camera in hand. The first to spot Patch was a young boy, brown hair, pudgy arms clutching a round pug. He pointed excitedly. "That's the dog from the video. Mom, look, it's him." His mother turned, surprise melting slowly into a smile. She didn't come closer, just placed a hand on her son's shoulder and whispered something. The boy nodded, then waved to Patch. Patch paused, lifted his head, and wagged his tail. Just once, lightly, but Hope saw it clearly. It was a tail wag for a stranger, with no fear behind it. There was a storytelling segment, where attendees were welcome to share their dogs' journeys. No pressure. Speak if you wished. Rowan meant to decline, but when his eyes found Patch, resting with his head on Hope's lap in the middle of the lawn, he realized there was nothing grand he needed to say, only something true. He stood. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed clear. He didn't come to us with a bark. He came with a silent leap into the car, no warning, no request, just the belief that he was supposed to be there. He asked for nothing, just a corner to breathe, to tremble, to not be pushed away again. We didn't rescue him. We just stayed when he needed someone to. And little by little he taught us what no training ever could, that there are beings who don't need words to say, "Thank you." They only need a tail to wag. Someone from the rescue group filmed Rowan's words. The clip, just 3 minutes long, simple, without background music, was posted on their homepage. Within 3 days, it had tens of thousands of views, hundreds of shares, and a flood of tearful, grateful comments. One read, "I always thought I wasn't good enough to have a dog. But maybe I just needed enough patience to offer someone a place to begin again." Another person had written, "Thank you, Patch, for not giving up on humans." Rowan read each line, one after another, without speaking. Hope sat beside him, her hand resting gently on Patch's back, where fur once came off in uneven patches, now grown soft and even again, like the early touch of autumn on trees not yet ready to turn. Patch's eyes were closed. He slept, not out of weariness, but because he believed, somehow, that the world, though still far from perfect, had made a space for those once left behind. A month later, on an afternoon steeped in golden light, Patch followed Hope to the town's elementary school, where she volunteered every Wednesday to read stories to children. The school stood on a low hill, flanked by a late-blooming row of jacarandas and a field so wide it didn't yet understand the meaning of boundaries. Patch didn't step into the classroom. He lay beneath the eaves, beside a stone bench, surrounded by the laughter of children playing hide-and-seek and sketching in pastel chalk across the brick-paved courtyard. A quiet girl named Lily, with curly hair, glasses too big for her face, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than chatter, sat carefully beside Patch, setting down a worn, stuffed bear beside him. "He's scared of strong winds," Lily whispered, as if afraid someone might laugh. "But maybe he won't be if he has a friend." Patch didn't move. He only opened his eyes, placed his head quietly near the bear, and slowly closed them again. Lily smiled and scooted a little closer. From that day on, every child at school knew Patch. No one called him the stray or the chained dog. They called him the therapy dog, not because he had a certificate, not because he'd been trained for it, but simply because he was there, because he had the patience to sit still when a child cried, the gentleness to lie motionless when tiny, trembling hands reached for his fur, and the silence to hear a story never told to anyone before. Patch didn't speak, but he seemed to know when to nuzzle a hand, when to lie just a little closer, and when to look away, so a child could cry without shame. Hope began writing Patch's journey, not as a diary, but as a letter to everyone who had ever believed they weren't worthy of forgiveness, or love, or a second chance. "Every creature deserves a second beginning," she wrote. The first line was typed late one windless night, while Patch lay beneath the desk, his head resting on Rowan's slipper. The last line was written just as dawn broke. Hope clicked post without editing a single word. The piece spread quickly. But what surprised her most wasn't the number of shares or comments. It was the handwritten letter that arrived from Patch's former shelter, the place that, years ago, had reduced him to nothing more than a steel cage number and a registration code. The manager wrote, "We didn't think Patch would ever recover. He didn't eat, didn't interact, didn't react. But it turns out, what he needed wasn't healing. It was a place where he didn't have to be healed to be loved." One winter afternoon, Lily came with her eyes red, her hands clenched, her voice quiet. She had just lost her cat. Patch didn't rush toward her. He only sat a few steps away, eyes following, and waited. Lily cried, then spoke. No one interrupted. Patch didn't move, until her story ended on a choked sob, and only then did he rise, step by step, toward her, lie down, and rest his head on her lap. It was the first time Hope saw a child hold Patch for that long without anyone telling her to. Rowan, standing nearby, a cup of coffee still steaming in his hand, said softly, "He's not a stray anymore." Hope nodded, her eyes fixed on Patch, head tucked into Lily's lap like someone who, too, had once lost something, and remembered. "He never was a stray," she said. "He was just someone trying to find his way home." That evening, the wind swept lightly across the porch. Dry leaves landed on the roof with the soft, breath-like rustle of things falling gently into their place, and the scent of pine slipped in through the windows, filling the house with a quiet peace that felt like the beginning of the holidays, even if Christmas had not yet arrived. Rowan lit an old oil lamp. The glow wasn't strong, but it was enough to bathe the living room in gold, where Patch lay fully stretched out across the center rug, no longer curled in, no longer pressed into the table legs, no longer turned toward the door with his back to the room. Hope leaned against the sofa, her hair falling across her shoulder, her hand resting close to Patch. Not touching, but near enough that, if he needed to, all he had to do was turn his head. Patch didn't turn. He slept. Truly slept. His chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm, like a dream still finding its shape. No sudden jolts, no soft whimpers, no broken cries like the nights before, when old nightmares still nipped at the edges of memory. The lamp's glow brushed gently over his smoky gray coat. Now full and even, an answer to what once seemed impossible to regrow. The fur around his neck had nearly covered the scar that once branded his silence. His back was no longer sunken. His tail rested long and calm, curved gently like the final punctuation mark of a sentence finally finished. Rowan sat beside the table, his hand resting on a book he never turned. He didn't read. He just watched. His gaze lingered on Patch for a long time, as if he were imprinting the image deep within himself, not to share, not to retell, but to hold in that quiet place inside a man where unrepeatable moments are kept. Hope's voice rose softly, barely above a whisper so as not to wake anything sacred. "What do you think he's dreaming about?" Rowan smiled, tilting his head. "Maybe a dream without the sound of locks clicking, without heavy footsteps behind him, without cold nights in a cage." Hope said nothing. She just looked at Patch, and in that dim, flickering light, she could have sworn she saw his lips twitch, like a smile. The next morning, Hope stepped out of the bedroom, a cup of steaming ginger tea in her hand. When the door opened, she stopped, stood there for a long while, captivated by the scene before her. Patch still lay on the living room floor, just as he had the night before. But this time, one of his legs stretched out, its paw resting against Rowan's leg. Rowan, who had fallen asleep on the sofa nearby, head tilted, arm hanging low, almost touching Patch. Two separate dreams intersecting, unplanned, unforced. Hope didn't wake them. She just sat down quietly, pulled her phone from her sweater pocket, and took a photo. Not to post, not for memory's sake, but for that one day when someone might ask, "How do you know when a creature is finally safe?" And she'd show them this picture and say, "When it sleeps, without needing to tremble." That afternoon, the last light of winter stretched like melted honey across the golden lawn, spilling from the porch all the way to the wooden fence where Patch usually lay each morning. But this time, he didn't rest his head on anyone's foot, nor curl beside the table or tuck under the sofa like in those early days. He lay in the center of the yard, full length, eyes half closed, his breath steady like a long-lost lullaby finally rediscovered. Hope sat on the steps. Beside her was Rowan, his arm around her shoulders, her hand resting on Patch's back. No one said anything at first. They just sat there in silence, like readers holding open a beautiful book they couldn't yet bring themselves to close. The wind rustled through the trees, making the dry leaves brush softly against one another. Like the quiet applause of nature, honoring the rare moment when a human soul and an animal soul find perfect stillness together. Rowan bowed his head, murmuring to himself. I can't remember when he started sleeping out here like this. Hope smiled. Maybe, when he realized he didn't have to guard the door anymore. Rowan nodded. Or, when he finally understood the door would always stay open, but no one would ever walk out and leave him behind. The sun dipped lower, its warmth turning orange and deep, softening everything it touched, as if even the weight of life's worries could be folded away and forgotten somewhere in the gentle cadence of footsteps, quiet touches, and wordless understanding. Patch stirred, just a little, not in fright, not in tension, just like someone who had dreamed of something kind and wanted to hold on to the echo. Hope gently stroked along his spine, each centimeter of fur once matted by fear, each line of muscle once drawn tight with trauma, now calm beneath the hand of someone he had chosen to trust. Then she turned to Rowan and whispered, "His name is Patch, not because he was torn, but because he's patched all of us back together." Rowan didn't reply. He simply laid his hand over hers, still resting on Patch, as if in that moment the three of them were no longer separate. No one carried a nameless wound anymore. No one survived alone in silence. Patch stretched a little farther. A small bird landed on the fence and sang a few high, sweet notes. Far off, children were laughing, chasing each other down the path. But amidst all that, Hope heard one thing clearly: Patch's heartbeat, steady and sure. Not fast, not forceful, just steady. Like the rhythm of a life no longer bracing against the world. That night, beneath the warm glow of the fireplace, Hope wrote the final line in her leather-bound notebook. A journal never meant for anyone but herself and Patch. Thank you for choosing to stay. Thank you for showing us that no wound is wasted if it leads us home. Your name is Patch, and you've mended this little world of ours. A closing from the heart for those who still believe in kindness. Not all of us have wealth to give, but all of us have time. A hand, a listening gaze, a flicker of belief in the good that never disappeared. Out there, just a few steps from where you are, countless souls, both human and animal, are carrying more than they were meant to, hoping someone might see them. Not with pity, but with presence. Take a walk one quiet weekend and visit a shelter for abandoned dogs or cats. Sign up for just 1 hour a month to teach at a community center. Listen to someone who's been silent for far too long. Share a story that matters, because no one knows how far a simple act can reach. A hand on a grocery cart. A warm meal on a cold night. A kind word on the edge of someone's breaking point. We spread light not to prove we are strong, but to remind each other we are not alone, that there is still reason to believe, still enough love left to ensure no one feels like the last soul on the margins. Because when we light the way for someone else, that flame also becomes our own. On the steep cliffs of Grayson Ridge, a faint howl echoed. No one noticed, except Lyra. She stopped, raised her binoculars, and froze. A German shepherd was stranded on a narrow ledge, his silent eyes locked onto hers like he'd been waiting for something long overdue. But when Lyra climbed to rescue him, she discovered something even more astonishing. The dog wasn't alone. And what he led her to wasn't just survival. It was a secret buried deep within the mountain. A truth that had waited for the right person to hear it. Morning in Grayson Ridge was unlike anywhere else. Before sunlight could even reach the stone peaks, it filtered through pale pine needles, casting a soft, silvery glow along the winding trail into the canyon. The air carried a hint of old stone and warm sap, mixed with the subtle sound of gravel shifting under hiking boots. Lyra Ainsley stopped, drawing in a deep breath. The scent of moss, dry dust, and resin clung to her lungs, familiar yet heavy, like something lodged behind the ribs. She hadn't returned here since that final time, the day she lost her footing in the mist, when the sound of splitting earth roared beneath her, and a massive rock tumbled within inches of her body, dragging with it her sense of control and belief in solid ground. Over a year had passed. The cliff remained unchanged, still, cold, and impossibly beautiful to look away from. "We're here," Lyra called, turning back to smile at the group of 6 teenagers trailing behind her. Her voice was steady, measured, deliberately gentle, as if every word had been weighed to avoid brushing against something fragile. Each of them carried an untold story, visible not through words but through silence, downcast gazes, or the instinct to keep just enough space from others. One boy, with tousled brown hair, kept his eyes fixed on the ground. A thin girl, always walking at the rear, clutched her backpack strap like it might vanish. And another boy, dark-skinned and wiry, walked fast, too fast, as if stopping would let something catch up. They didn't need to say anything. Neither did she. Lyra understood her role wasn't to make anyone speak, but simply to hold space for them to stand, breathe, and exist in a world without judgment. "We'll rest here for 10 minutes, she said, pointing to a flat patch of ground near the ridge's edge. "From here, you can see the Western Valley, one of the highest points in Grayson Ridge." The group quietly dispersed, settling into the stillness. The sound of zippers, water bottles filling, protein bars breaking, each noise small, but none unsettling. It was the kind of silence that didn't ache, a silence that felt whole, like a wound that had closed its skin, not yet its bones, but had stopped bleeding. Lyra didn't sit down. She took a few steps closer to the edge, where the grass thinned out and grew low against the earth. The breeze wasn't strong, but it teased the ends of her hair just enough to brush her coat. Ahead, the valley unfolded in hazy mist, dotted with streaks of sunlight reflecting off limestone peaks, golden flares strung like silk across the old scars of the earth. Below, the layered rock formations twisted like a silent maze, and somewhere within that labyrinth, over a year ago, she had crumpled, trembling amid the echoes of falling stone and the thudding chaos inside her chest. The memory returned without warning. That day, she had led a small hiking group toward the western summit. Rain had come sudden. Soil gave way in sheets. She slipped, not far, but the ledge she had gripped had vanished beneath her. She wasn't seriously hurt. But from that moment on, she no longer trusted things that once felt unshakable. Grayson Ridge, to her, wasn't just a place. It was a reminder. A fracture. "Miss Lyra!" a voice called from behind. The brown-haired boy. His first words of the trip. "Yeah?" she replied softly. "I found this." He held out a feather, gray with tiny specks of black near the shaft. A rock hawk feather. Lyra accepted it with a gentle smile. "Good eyes. Rock hawks don't fly low. Maybe it just passed over the ridge. I saw it fall right in front of me. Kind of like," he hesitated, "like someone dropped it." Lyra tilted her head. The words stirred something in her, not fear but memory, the brief sensation of falling, of being caught mid-air by instinct alone, by the precise swing of a hook before gravity won. "Everything that soars has to fall once," she said calmly. not to break, just to find out where it can rise again. The boy didn't answer, but his gaze lingered longer than before. She kept the feather, sliding it into her jacket pocket. Not because it was rare, but because today, anything that reminded her of Grayson Ridge in a softer way was worth holding on to. In the distance, the wind picked up again. A light, cold gust swept through the valley, and the cliff face glistened faintly in the early sun. No one noticed as Lyra gently gripped her left wrist, the place where the scar still lay, faint like memory but never truly gone. She hadn't come back to conquer the mountain. She came to face it. And somewhere, she didn't know exactly where, Grayson Ridge was waiting too. Not to challenge her, but to see if anyone could stand and not lower their gaze. By just past 9 in the morning, the group had reached their first hands-on climb, a long incline along the southern face, where the stone was streaked with pale moss, but still dry enough to grip. Lyra checked each carabiner, every anchor point, then guided the teens one by one along the marked route. She didn't lead the group from the front, as she usually did. Today, she held back a little, watching every step, every flicker in their eyes as they worked through fear, because their steadiness was the only confirmation she needed that coming back here had been the right choice. A faint breeze passed, bringing with it the distant scent of scorched grass somewhere down in the valley. The sun was already high, casting angled light across the ridgeline. Bold strokes of brightness and shade layered like a landscape carved by a knife. And then, it came. A sound. Not loud, but strange, just sharp enough to make Lyra freeze mid-motion, her fingers still gripping a ledge. A howl. Short, not urgent, but carrying the brittle crack of pain that had waited too long to be heard. It came from the opposite cliff, where the mountainside rose nearly vertical, a place too treacherous for most to even attempt. She thought she imagined it. But then the second howl came, clearer, deeper. This time it wasn't just her. One of the teens above looked back and called, "Ms. Lyra, did you hear that?" She gave a small nod, eyes fixed on where the sound had come from. Everyone halted. 6 climbers, scattered along the route, frozen without needing to be told. No one spoke, no one moved. Only the wind buzzed against the ropes. A third howl, shorter, like the voice behind it was beginning to fail. Lyra furrowed her brow, scanning the opposing cliff. Her eyes darted across the ledges between crevices. Nothing. Just layers of gray stone stacked on silver, jagged like the back of some ancient beast sleeping beneath the sky. She adjusted the binoculars hanging from her chest, an old habit from her earliest climbs. She swept slowly, methodically, missing no corner. On her third pass, something flickered into view, a tiny spot, barely there, like a smudge of fur clinging to stone. She tightened her grip, zoomed in, her heart stalled for a beat. A dog, a German shepherd, black and tan, body lean but caked with dust, stood pressed against a ledge no wider than 16 inches. The dog didn't move. Its ears were up but tucked, the frame slightly trembling. Beneath him, a vertical drop, straight down, beyond the reach of any safe fall. One misstep, and everything would disappear in a blink. Lowering the binoculars, Lyra turned to the nearest teen and whispered, "Stay right there. I'm going down first. No one moves unless I say so." She began descending the rock face, hand tracing familiar holds. She didn't explain further, just signaled the assistant instructor to keep the group steady and calm. Once on flat ground, she grabbed her radio and spoke quickly, voice low but urgent. "Grayson Ridge, marker G7. I've spotted a German shepherd stranded on the opposite cliff face. Estimated elevation 200 feet. Ledge is extremely narrow. Risk of rockfall high. Requesting animal rescue confirmation." A crackled reply came. "Received. but mobile rescue team will take at least 90 minutes to reach your location. She lowered the radio. Her eyes returned across the gap. The dog was still there, no barking now, no more howls, just breathing hard and trembling, like he had poured everything into one last cry for help, and now was simply waiting. But waiting for how long? And how had a dog ended up somewhere no human could reasonably climb? Dozens of thoughts raced through her mind. Abandonment, an accident, or something far more serious. Whatever the case, that dog was alive. And looking at her, not with fear, not with blame, but with a quiet expectancy. Waiting for someone calm enough to hear a cry that didn't come from a person, and brave enough to break from plan, for a life standing right at the threshold between survival and the void. The wind swept again. Not strong, but cold enough to send a chill through her spine. Not from fear, from realization. The memory she thought she had left behind at Grayson Ridge wasn't the only thing that had stayed. Something else was waiting to be rescued. The sun had now fully risen, scattering mid-morning light across the far peaks. Threads of gold stretched over the ridges, casting glimmering spots along the ground, dancing like fireflies in the early breeze. The chill had faded, replaced by a creeping warmth radiating from the stone, just enough to trick the skin and cloud the judgment of any climber who forgot how thin the margin here could be. Lyra knelt on the uneven stone, her fingers gripping the binoculars, her eyes fixed on the ledge across the canyon. The dog was still there, a German shepherd, coat dark with ash-gray dust, a worn leather collar barely visible around its neck, standing as still as a sculpture carved into the cliff itself. No bark, no howl, just breath, shallow, quick, as the sun rose past the mountain's edge and cast its light directly onto the fragile space where the dog stood. The sunlight that morning wasn't harsh, but it was piercing. Under that light, the dog's coat shimmered as if dusted with fine metal, a breathtaking image that somehow felt more painful than beautiful. The ledge beneath him was no wider than a hand and a half. A shift by mere inches would tilt his balance, and below, only air, swallowing even the smallest bits of loose stone that dared fall from the rock. Lowering her binoculars, Lyra wiped the sweat beading at her brow, though the breeze still moved gently around her. She reached for the radio clipped to her belt, adjusted the frequency, and spoke with calm clarity. "Grayson Ridge, this is point G7. The dog's status is unchanged. I need an updated ETA on the rescue team." The line crackled a moment before a male voice responded, urgent but bound in protocol. "Rescue team dispatched from South Station. Terrain requires detour. Estimated time including gear prep is 120 minutes. That ledge is outside the safe radius for helicopter access." Lyra paused. 120 minutes is too long," she said, still watching the opposite cliff. "I'm in position for manual approach. I have rope, anchors, full kit, and training. Please notify Area Command. I'm requesting approval to initiate individual approach. Solo climbs on unstable incline zones are strongly discouraged. Are you aware of the current geological risks in that region?" "I'm aware," she answered, voice unwavering. "I'm also aware that a German shepherd standing on that ledge will not last another 120 minutes." The other end fell silent, maybe weighing the risk, maybe recording the call. But Lyra didn't wait. She stood, sunlight slanting across her face, casting a long, curling shadow behind her on the stone. She reached into the third pocket of her pack, where the primary harness was stored. Climbing rope, carabiners, waist strap, cross ties, soft wraps for the wrists, all still clean, coiled, untouched since her last summit. But now they felt heavier, not from weight, but from meaning. This wasn't an ordinary climb. It wasn't about reaching a peak or conquering fear. It was something else entirely, No glory, no triumph, only the chance to be the difference between life and a fall no one would survive. A dog. No one knew why it was there. No one knew who had left it behind, or what had driven it to that narrow strip of stone. But it was alive, and it had used every ounce of breath to send out a single cry, just enough for someone to hear. And Lyra had heard it. Above, a voice called down from the teens. "Ms. Lyra, are you coming back up?" She looked up, the sun catching her eyes. Her reply was softer. "Stay where you are. Support crew will arrive soon. I've got something to take care of." "Are you going alone?" She paused, then smiled. A quiet smile, one only she understood, masking the pulse pounding hard inside her chest. "I've never really been alone on this mountain." And with that, she turned, heading for the low incline that led toward the opposite ridge, the side no marked trail had ever claimed, the one labeled on the topo maps with a single cautionary line, not suitable for untrained ascent. But Lyra didn't need a map to know where she was going. She only needed to remember that on the far side, there were still a pair of bright brown eyes watching this direction. And if she reached in time, this morning light wouldn't be the last to touch the dusty gray fur stretched so thin across that ledge. She followed a narrow strip of scree trailing along the base of the mountain. Under the rising sun, her shadow lengthened over the gray stone beneath her, a solitary figure, but filled with resolve. Every step she took was steady, not rushed, not hesitant. As if the entire mountain had stopped to bear witness to someone rising at the very place where she had once fallen. The terrain leading to the foot of the cliff where the dog was stranded wasn't built for the average climber. No formal paths, no trail markings, just sloped rock and loose earth, broken by unpredictable ridges and jagged footholds, exactly the kind of terrain that forced anyone who had ever fallen to weigh each step with more than just muscle. But Lyra didn't hesitate. She calculated, with her eyes, with her body's instincts, with the experience of someone who had once hung from vertical cliffs in British Columbia and sheer slopes in Tasmania. And this time, it wasn't for records or cameras. It was for a life, waiting in silence. When she reached the base, she exhaled slowly, removed her pack, and laid out every piece of gear before her. Beside her was a flat stone slab, sheltered from the wind, with a full view of the cliff ahead. She spread each rope with care. First, the primary red line, 40 meters, used for full-body suspension. It had been her lifeline in Kyrgyzstan, still bearing faint scuff marks where it had once wrapped around an anchor. Lyra ran her fingers over its length, inspecting each coil before neatly winding it again. Then came the slim steel alloy pitons, light but strong, meant to create temporary anchor points on untouched rock faces. She would need more than usual. This wasn't a rehearsed route. No one had mapped this wall. Next, she pulled out her tension harness, normally used to distribute body weight when suspended on slanted terrain. But today, she would adapt it. It had to carry not one body, but two. Hers, and a four-legged creature that had never been trained for rescue. Finally, from the bottom of her pack, she retrieved a wide, braided green strap, originally meant to retrieve dropped gear or build makeshift grips. But today, she had a new purpose for it, to craft a harness for the dog. She added a few extra carabiners, clicking pieces together into a square loop. Her eyes never left the opposite ledge, where the dog, still nameless, remained hunched, panting hard, yet unmoved. "Just stay right there," she whispered, as if the wind might carry her voice across. She began constructing a temporary anchor system. Selecting a deep fissure in the higher rock, she fixed 3 wedge bolts into place, forming a tension triangle, stable, secure, and ready for the primary rope. Her movements were fluid, deliberate, muscle memory guiding her with the silent rhythm of someone who'd done this countless times. But this time, the trigger wasn't a summit. It was a heartbeat. Each rope was checked, coiled, and placed with precision. There was no room for error, no trace of uncertainty. Just a pair of hands working with the quiet seriousness of someone preparing to bring someone home from the edge. Once everything was set, she sat down, drew the green strap into her lap, and began folding and tying it into shape. Chest loop, belly wrap, shoulder lines, all sized for a full-grown dog. Her fingers moved fast, tightening each knot with care. "Not a professional rig," she muttered, tying the last knot, "but it'll breathe easier than that ledge." She tugged every joint, tested its tension, flexed its give. Everything held. When she stood, the entire rescue system was in place. A hand-built rig, but trustworthy, born of skill, discipline, and the unwavering belief that no life deserved to be left behind just because it couldn't speak. The sun poured down over her shoulders now, golden and soft, no longer harsh. It coated her back like melted honey, gilding the silhouette of a woman preparing for a climb no one had ever made. In the distance, the wind rustled across the cliff and carried a faint, wavering howl. Weak, but still there. Like an answer. Like a promise unspoken. With a final twist of the last carabiner into the locking ring, Lyra gave the rope a strong pull, checking tension from all 3 anchor points. Her movements were firm, unhurried, as though her hands had done this 1,000 times, though her palms trembled now. Not from fear, from something deeper. Instinct. Before her stood a chalk-white wall, sloped at over 70 degrees. No margin for mistakes, no clear footholds. Just fine fractures slicing across pale rock like veins beneath tired skin. She stepped onto the first outcrop, pressing her weight in slowly, then lifted herself up, body flush against stone, the rope tightening with every motion. Even within the first meter, small pebbles crackled beneath her boots, specks no larger than peppercorns tumbling into the quiet air below. But Lyra didn't stop. She couldn't think of the full distance, only the next move. Her gloves were already soaked, not with dew, but sweat. It bled through the fabric, dripping along her forearms. The angled sunlight turned every speck of dust into gold, floating mid-air in front of her, like the whole cliffside was breathing. She gripped a flat hold the width of her palm, reached to the right for the next anchor. Each groove worn into the rock told of years of wind and weather grinding down its surface. She pulled her body higher. Another meter, one more beat of her heart, and paused. There was no sound but her own breathing, the faint rasp of rope against rock, and silence. The dog across the way still hadn't made a single sound. No howl, no whimper, not even the slightest movement. That silence worried Lyra more than any desperate cry. Silence meant something had begun to give up. She gritted her teeth and kept climbing. Each meter passed like a question pressed into stone. She had no answers, only hands that gripped, feet that searched, and a heart drawn toward a pair of eyes she had never seen, but which somehow felt uncannily familiar. Lyra reached a sheer stretch where the rock gleamed like glass. The sunlight bounced into her eyes, blinding her momentarily. She closed them for a second, exhaled long and slow. Then she extended her left hand, finding a slit just wide enough to wedge her index and middle finger. Engaging her core, she shifted her weight to the right, placed the tip of her boot on a nub of rock no wider than 2 knuckles, and leaned in. A moment of weightlessness swept through her body. But then, the rope tightened. The anchor held. She climbed again. Behind her, open space. Before her, a blazing cliff. And between those 2 immensities was her. One human, one decision, one journey that couldn't be measured in meters or minutes, only in the choice to keep going, even if just one step at a time. After nearly 30 minutes, she reached a narrow ledge wide enough to pause. She clipped a safety carabiner, hooked her water bottle to the anchor line, and unscrewed the cap. The icy water slipped down her dry throat, but she drank only a little, just enough to soothe. When she looked up for the first time, she saw the dog more clearly. The ledge he stood on was only about 7 meters away on a diagonal. His fur was matted from wind and sun, dust caked across his face and neck, one ear drooping, but his eyes were open, steady, locked onto hers. That look didn't plead, it didn't despair, it waited for something unspoken, without reason, without needing to know who was climbing toward him. Lyra pressed her lips together, nodding quietly to herself. No words passed between them, but the light had changed. It softened, draping across the ridge in a golden curtain, pouring down between two strangers, one human, one canine, who seemed somehow to have recognized something in each other. She slowed her breathing, reached up one final time toward the last silver line of ledge, just barely visible in the corner of her eye. She lifted herself, boot touching the ridge, and latched her safety rope into a narrow groove just big enough to hold her weight. And the moment both her feet landed squarely on the ledge, their eyes met. Time slackened. Under slanted sunlight, amid floating dust and a silence taut as string, Lyra felt as if she were seeing something. Not new, not foreign, but startling in its familiarity. The dog was a black and tan German shepherd, fur thick and coarse, clumped with weather and grit. His frame was lean, skeletal at the hips and shoulders, but he stood firm. 4 paws planted, eyes wide, alert, no trembling. Lyra lifted her helmet slightly, clearing her view, then lowered into a rounded posture. Not approaching, not imposing. Just enough to say, "I'm not a threat." "Hey there," she said softly, her voice low and even, as if speaking to someone waking from a long sleep. "I'm Lyra." The dog didn't retreat, didn't bark. He tilted his head slightly, ears twitching, one nearly torn in half, perhaps from falling rock or a hard blow long ago. She extended her left hand, palm up, wrist exposed, the way seasoned handlers do, presenting the neutral, scentless part of the arm, a quiet invitation, nothing forced. The dog took a single step. His front left paw pressed gently against the loose edge. Behind, his back left leg hesitated, and in that pause, Lyra saw it. An old wound, never quite healed. A gash stretched from thigh to knee joint, fur there tinted gray and dry red. She shifted left, making space, then unhooked the green strap from her side pack, threading it through small carabiners to shape a harness. "You're not going to have to jump," she murmured, eyes on his. "I'll anchor the line. We'll descend together, slow." For the first time, he stepped forward again, then sat down. No sound, no growl, just those eyes, steady and unreadable, trying to say something wordless. She spoke once more, though this time not aloud. A name formed in her mind. Clear, as if it had been spoken countless times before. Rook. Lyra exhaled. She didn't know why that name had come. No reason, no logic. But when she said it again, quietly, "Rook." The dog lifted his head. Then, slowly, he walked forward until only a meter separated them. Now she was close enough to reach the dog's neck, carefully threading the green harness around his chest and flank. Her fingers brushed his coarse fur, warm breath streaming softly from his nose as he locked eyes with her. "All right, Rook," she whispered, fastening the final carabiner through the harness loop. I'm getting you out of here. The auxiliary tether was already secured to her safety belt. She clipped Rook's lead into the same anchor point as hers and double-checked every knot, every loop, every line. When she gently tightened the strap, Rook didn't resist. He stood firm, eyes steady on hers, as if saying, "I know you won't hurt me." Below, her radio crackled to life. A voice came through, urgent but controlled. "We're approaching the access ridge. ETA 20 minutes. Lyra, what's your status?" She answered simply, her voice calm. "I found him. And we're ready." Wind shifted through the canyon, lifting Rook's neck fur as his eyes stayed fixed on her. In that moment, Lyra no longer saw a stranded animal, not an abandoned soul. She saw a silent warrior, a spirit that hadn't surrendered, and she realized the climb wasn't about rescuing a dog. It was about retrieving a part of herself she'd left behind in the broken stone years ago. Just as she finished securing the last knot, a deep, cracking sound burst behind her. She spun instantly, just in time to see a massive slab of rock peel from the mountain, dragging a storm of dust behind it like a torn curtain spilling from the sky. Seconds later, another crack followed, louder, sharper. The ground beneath her boots vibrated. She yanked Rook close, shielding him with her arm, eyes locked on the cascading landslide tearing through the very path she had just climbed. Rock struck rock, echoing like thunder, debris crashing into the ledges below. One massive fragment crushed the very anchor point she had first used, burying it in a cloud of stone. She understood immediately. The way down was gone. There was no need to search for alternatives. Lyra knew this cliff well. Once the upper layer collapsed, the remaining anchors couldn't bear doubled weight. She and Rook were now stranded, perched on a ledge barely the width of a forearm, suspended in the sky of Grayson Ridge, surrounded by wind, light, and no exit. Rook shifted. His body tensed. Ears shot up. He stared toward the other ridge, a low, rumbling sound built in his throat, not aggression but something closer to warning or survival instinct. Lyra placed a hand on his back, gently stroking. "I hear it too," she murmured, eyes scanning the rock to the right. And there she saw it, pale stone streaked with gold, smoother, less fractured, wide enough for a new anchor. Sliding her hand to her waist, she pulled out a fresh set of clips. Rope remained, not much, but enough to make a traverse. The problem, that direction wasn't downward, it was lateral. A side route across the cliff to a secondary ledge that might offer a safer descent along the mountain's back face. But that meant they would be moving sideways, across vertical rock, without rest stops, without midpoint anchors. Every single step would hold the weight of 2 lives, 1 woman, 1 dog, and 1 rope, binding them to each other. She turned to Rook. His eyes weren't afraid, just steady, waiting for the signal. She spoke softly, not to comfort him, but to hear herself believe it. "We're going that way. I won't lie, it's not easy. But if you stay with me, I'll make sure you don't fall." She added a chest tether to Rook's harness, connecting them with a mobile twin system. Every time she moved, the rope would guide him, yet maintain safe spacing. Rook didn't flinch. He stood calm, shifting instinctively with the rope, leaning into her setup so she could stabilize his weight. The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of damp rock and moss from the untouched ledge ahead. The scent of life. Lyra began moving rightward, feet stepping onto polished incline, body pressed tight against stone. Each movement deliberate, her weight writing new language into the mountain with every motion, and Rook, miraculously, followed without panic. He balanced on 3 legs, sometimes pausing until the rope tugged taut, then stepping forward. His ears were always turned toward her, like a compass tuned to breath. Each time she glanced left, the abyss stretched far and quiet, deep blue carved beneath peaks that seemed to swallow the sky. And in between it all, her and Rook, two tiny beings, holding on by a thread and something stronger. Unspoken trust. Suddenly, a rock dislodged from high above. It bounced, gaining speed, slicing the face of the cliff, headed straight for them. Lyra could only yell, "Rook!" But he didn't need words. He leaned into her instantly, pressed close, and their bodies tilted in unison. The stone shot past, brushing the rope, slamming into the ledge beneath them, then vanishing into the canyon. She held her breath, turned. Rook was still watching her. No panic, no tremble. Only eyes that said, "I'm here." She nodded. Once, no words, no need. And then she moved forward again, inching towards the patch of sun spilling diagonally across the far edge, where maybe, just maybe, a path still waited. If they could reach it in time. Just as Lyra placed her final foot onto the horizontal ridge of the stable rock face, before she could even unclip the temporary rope from her harness, Rook's ears shot up, his body tightening like an arrow about to be released. "What is it?" she whispered, eyes still scanning when Rook stepped forward, 2 paces to the edge, nose lifting, head tilting slightly as if tracking a faint echo. Then it came. A bark. Weak, broken. Not Rook's earlier howl. This was sharper, higher pitched, like a smaller breed trying to cry out but lacking the strength to make it carry. Rook responded with a low, resonant growl. Not aggressive, but deliberate. A signal. The kind of unspoken code used by trained animals who understood mission and kin beyond what humans could grasp. Lyra held her breath. She quickly unclipped the binoculars from her belt, raised them to her eyes, and followed Rook's fixed gaze across the adjacent ridge. And then she saw it. Brown stains scattered across the gray stone, and just behind that, a black and white shape. 2 dogs. A border collie, thick fur marked with classic white and black, and a yellow-tan mixed retriever, shorter coated, lying awkwardly on its side, one front leg curled under unnaturally, a dark crust of red visible at the joint. They were stranded, perched 2 levels higher, too far to hear a heartbeat, but close enough that from the retriever's posture alone, Lyra knew it was in pain. Left too long, and the blood at that wound could freeze inside the fissures. She lowered the binoculars, looked to Rook. He hadn't moved, still staring directly at the 2 dogs. Then a single bark, short, firm. The border collie twitched, lifted its head, shook slightly as if replying. It looked like communication. "That's your pack?" Lyra murmured. Rook didn't look at her, but his tail flicked faintly, and his eyes grew impossibly clear. In that moment, she didn't need confirmation. She felt it, like people who'd once been lost could recognize each other without a single word. She activated her radio. "Rescue team, this is Lyra. I've reached the German Shepherd, but there are 2 more dogs trapped on a higher ledge. One's badly injured." A reply cut through static. "We're approaching point 3, preparing for airlift. Estimated 25 minutes minimum." Lyra frowned. Once again, like clockwork since morning, waiting meant losing a life. She looked back up towards the upper ledge. It wasn't far in height, but the location was brutal. Jutting out, no intermediate anchors, and wind sweeping from the left would make any climb demand absolute precision. She glanced at Rook, still silent. But when she stepped forward, so did he, as if neither of them had any choice left but to go on. "We're climbing again, Rook," she said, eyes locked on the next ascent. "This one's going to be twice as hard." Rook turned toward her. There wasn't a flicker of hesitation. Lyra uncoiled the last length of rope, looped it through her carabiner, pulled out a long bolt, and set up a temporary anchor on the most solid portion of the rock's edge. She knew. This would be the final climb their gear could sustain. "If we don't save all three," she whispered, as if to the wind, "I won't forgive myself." She began the climb, and Rook, as if already knowing the terrain, moved at an angle, quicker, more decisive. At times he paused on small ledges, glanced back, signaling her like a guide. Lyra blinked in astonishment. It felt as though he'd been here before. Each step wasn't driven by necessity alone, but by an unseen tether between a human and a creature that couldn't speak, couldn't apologize, but somehow always chose to stay. And across the sheer cliff face, with afternoon sunlight fading westward and washing each stone in bold strokes of golden orange, Lyra and Rook once again found one another on the path, walked by the forgotten. She knew she was running out of strength. Her fingers throbbed from holding rope too long, her arms trembled each time she stretched to hold her weight. Her breath no longer came steady like in the morning. It stuttered, broke apart, every inhale scraping her ribs like stone blades. But at a certain point in the sky, as she looked down, toward the collapsed ledge, the buried anchor, and the vanished way back, Lyra understood. The question was no longer, should I keep climbing? It was, can I live with letting someone lose their only chance to be saved? And she chose to keep climbing. Her left foot found a jagged ledge, the rock slick with wind-blown dust, but she shifted all her weight to the right to stay balanced. Her right hand reached upward, searching for a shallow groove to lock into. Every upward move was not just a test of physical endurance. It was a reaffirmation of will in someone who once believed she no longer had the strength to return to the cliffs of her past. Rook moved beside her. He didn't rush ahead, didn't lead, but always kept just enough distance for Lyra to see. Every time she paused, he paused. When she tightened her harness, he sat and looked back. And when she struggled to catch her breath, Rook didn't growl or bark. He simply watched, as if he understood that sometimes patience itself was an act of rescue. The wind at that altitude grew harsher, not cool drafts anymore, but dry, biting gusts that slapped across their faces like invisible hands of the mountain, demanding both of them brace against it. Yet the late afternoon sunlight shifted to a honeyed gold, casting a soft glow across the upper ridges, transforming what had looked unreachable into something that, just maybe, held promise. When they reached a slab just wide enough for a human body, Lyra dropped to her knees, both arms folded over the rock's edge, not from despair, but to listen for the beat of her own heart, still thudding. Rook padded over, placed his head gently atop her wrist. No bark, no nudge, just contact. A quiet gesture more honest than any question. "Do we keep going?" Lyra nodded. No words needed. She knew. Rook knew. They both understood this was something no one had asked them to do, but their conscience would never allow them to walk away. If someone once waited for Rook, she thought, then surely they also believed in loyalty, the way you believe in me now. The remaining distance to the ledge where the two dogs were trapped was barely 10 meters on a diagonal. But it was the most dangerous stretch yet. No auxiliary anchors, no visible cracks wide enough for rope. The only path forward was trust, in her footing, in the rope, and in the silent companion standing inches from her side. And then, like something from a slowed-down reel, Rook moved ahead, choosing a line that angled left, where 3 raised footholds jutted out faintly. He climbed easily, sure-footed, and then paused, turned back, waiting. Showing me the way? Lyra muttered with a weary, grateful smile. She followed the exact path Rook had just taken, and under the slanted light she noticed it, faint reflections where his paws had touched. The holds seemed to glow just enough to be seen, as if trust itself had made them visible. One step, then another, then a third, and at last they reached a narrow shelf, barely wide enough for two bodies shoulder to shoulder. Above, the soft whimper of the retriever drifted down, weak but unmistakable. Lyra looked up. The border collie was seated beside the injured dog, eyes locked on Lyra, not barking, not trembling, just waiting. And in that moment, beneath howling wind and cliffs carved by time, Lyra was no longer a guide, no longer someone broken, fearful, avoiding cliffs ever since the fall a year ago. She was the only one here, clear-headed, brave, and blessed enough to be chosen as the next to cross fear's edge. Rook licked her hand. Then they climbed again. The ledge the two dogs were stranded on didn't appear on any topographic map Lyra had ever seen. Its incline was unnatural, its surface no wider than a blade's curve jutting out from the mountain. From below, it looked invisible. Only up close, eye level, could one see it. Just enough space to stand, not enough to slip. She looked up. Her hair clung to her scalp, sweat dried beneath her helmet. Her eyes tracked each crack in the rock, measured weight distribution, then shifted forward, millimeter by millimeter. Rook no longer kept distance. He walked closer now, sometimes leaning his head lightly against her leg. Not for support, but to stabilize them both. Then the wind struck. Not in roaring gusts, but in short, shrill bursts that sliced through rock gaps like fingers trying to unravel rope, testing every grip. One of Lyra's anchor lines jolted loose, the clip smacking hard against the stone. She stiffened, clenched the lock, and froze. "There's no turning back," she whispered. "This place wasn't made for surveyors. It's made for those who already know. They can't go back." Rook growled gently, not out of fear, but as if to remind her. There are still lives ahead, waiting. She looked up. The border collie still held its gaze. The retriever, soaked in sweat and blood, one front leg curled unnaturally, lifted its head at the sight of her shadow, then collapsed again. Lyra didn't think. She dropped low, pressed her chest to the rock, angled her body to reduce drag from the wind. One hand gripped the rope, the other reached for every anchor point, eyes scanning for the next viable hold. Rook moved ahead, his body agile, precise, the instincts of a working dog fully awake, as if he'd been born of this mountain. And then, they made it, the space between them and the injured dogs. No more than an arm's length. The border collie let out a soft whine, a choked welcome, like someone who had held on to hope until the very last moment. The retriever lay still, panting, eyes half closed, but his ears still twitched faintly at the sound of footsteps. Lyra knelt down. There was no room left for fear, no energy left for hesitation. She assessed the wound quickly, a long gash along the left leg, the blood crusted stiff, with signs of infection already setting in. The retriever didn't growl, didn't flinch. He simply lifted his gaze to meet hers, a silent surrender of trust into the hands of a stranger. "It's okay. You're okay," she whispered, gently patting his shoulder. The wind rose again. Stronger this time. From deep within the gorge, dust spiraled upward, slipping into the cracks in the stone, stinging her face and slipping between her lips. The ropes began to quiver. Behind her, the cliff they'd just climbed let out a faint crack. Another fracture had opened. She knew the rescue team would need a signal, and just as her eyes scanned the terrain for anything reflective, Rook suddenly dipped his head, gripped his own collar gently with his teeth, and pulled. Lyra followed his movement. A small mirror, square, fixed to the inner side of Rook's collar, caught the sunlight and flared blindingly as the late light angled in just right. She understood instantly. Unclipping the mirror, she shifted her weight against the rock, leaned her shoulder at a 45-degree angle, and began signaling flashes in Morse. Short, long, short. 3 dogs, high, need descent. They couldn't hear voices down in the valley, but light never got lost. A minute passed. Rook sat close beside her, watching the gorge below. The wind didn't ease. The border collie had taken position beside the wounded retriever, guarding, shielding, refusing to let his companion wait alone. Then, across the air, another flash answered. Bright. Steady. Simple code. Copy. 15 minutes. Hold. Lyra clenched her fist. We're not falling. Not now that they know we're here, she said, her hand resting on Rook's back. The dog looked up at her. No bark, no nod, but his gaze was enough. This wasn't some dot on a map. This was a place remembered, etched in wind and stone, because someone refused to give up here. Even if it was just a sliver of rock carved into a cliff. Today, it was the place where life held on. She didn't rush to strap harnesses or adjust ropes. She let herself sit for a moment, breathing slow, her back against the jagged wall behind them, her eyes never leaving the 3 living beings gathered close. None of them barked, none whined, but something stronger than sound passed between them. Connection. The retriever stirred. Worn and weak, he limped forward as Lyra pulled out a thick fabric strap and the rescue loop. The border collie touched his nose to the retriever's cheek, almost a whisper of comfort. And Rook stayed at post, like a soldier who knew that loyalty didn't mean loud declarations. It meant watching over everyone in silence. I came after, Lyra whispered, skillfully wrapping the strap around the retriever's chest and belly. But you 3, you've always been a team. She didn't know the retriever's name, didn't know if the collie had ever been trained. But the way they never strayed from each other, the way Rook glanced over from time to make sure they were still all right, it told her everything she needed. There was something far deeper than instinct tying them together. The temporary harness was secured with 2 double knots, a loose locking clip connecting to the main line. Lyra checked again, then carefully clipped it into a fresh anchor she'd drilled into a narrow stone groove. The click of metal echoed sharp and crisp in the wide stillness, like even the smallest breath could reach the heart of the mountain. The retriever shivered, not out of fear, but from sheer exhaustion after enduring so much. But when Lyra whispered, "Almost there?" he lifted his head. Not in surprise, but with the look of someone who still, somehow, believed. "You're braver than any student I've ever taught," Lyra murmured, brushing his ear. "And I won't let you fall." She turned to the border collie. He wasn't injured, but he hadn't left the retriever's side for a second. Even when she slipped the strap around his chest, he twisted his head to monitor every motion. When she clipped the lock shut, he leaned over and licked the retriever's nose once more, as if making sure they'd go together. Lyra froze for a second. In all her years of guiding, teaching, and rehabilitation, she'd seen hundreds of eyes, wounded kids, guarded hearts, old scars with no names. But she had rarely seen a touch as loyal and pure as this one. And then, with every rope and strap checked 3 times over, she turned to Rook. He sat there, back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon below the valley, where the signal from the rescue team still blinked in steady intervals, minute by minute. Maybe Rook was counting the time, or maybe he was simply standing guard over the last fragment of hope making sure the wind didn't carry it away. "Thank you," Lyra said, her voice soft as breath. "No one could guard this place better than you." Rook turned. He stepped forward, touched his nose to her hand, then backed away. In that moment, she understood. They hadn't been waiting for someone to rescue them. They'd been waiting for someone who understood what it meant to survive. And somehow, though she wasn't stronger or braver than anyone else, they had chosen her. The wind picked up again. Not violent this time, not shaking ropes, but like a slow, steady breath from the mountain, an unseen farewell. High above, the sun dipped westward, drawing golden-orange slashes across the towering stone walls. Lyra tightened the final carabiner, pulled the locking rope into position for descent. She didn't rush. She knew one misstep, one hurried move, and the entire system could shift off balance. Before lowering down, she knelt among the 3 dogs, placing a hand on each shoulder, equally deliberately. "We're going down together," she said. "No one gets left behind. Not human. Not dog." The border collie lifted his head, tapping his tail lightly against her leg. The wounded retriever rested his chin on her boot, a silent agreement. And Rook, as always, said nothing. But the way he rose and walked to the edge, the way he stepped forward, was exactly how a guardian opens the way home. The descent began in silence. No growling, no roaring wind, no urgent commands like those drilled in high-stress training, only the quiet click of rope and carabiner, the soft taps of canine paws against rock, and the invisible rhythm of a determination too steady for words. Lyra took the rear. Ahead of her, Rook led, his black and tan coat rippling with each shift, every movement calculated not with reason, but with the instincts of a creature who had known the mountain longer than any map could show. The border collie was clipped to a secondary harness, trailing just behind Rook, close enough to react, far enough to monitor. Though uninjured, he looked back every few meters, eyes wide, fixed on the retriever, like a friend who knew exactly why he was still standing. The retriever was tethered to Lyra's main support line, anchored at her waist. His weight created a downward pull, demanding precision. Each step Lyra took felt like carrying a flame through a storm. The slope leaned at 65 degrees. Around them, stone ledges and thin moss trembled gently, like the deep breath of some giant stirring beneath the mountain. There was no collapse, no sudden crack. But Lyra knew the stillness was temporary, and each second spent on this ledge was a quiet gamble with time. Rook paused at a horizontal outcrop, wide enough for all 3 dogs to rest while she adjusted the anchors. Lyra knelt, knees against the coarse stone, hands shaking from blood pooling in her fingertips. But she allowed no pause longer than a breath. When she looked up, Rook was still scanning the descent below, never turning, never waiting for praise. He was simply doing what needed to be done. Silently, with purpose. "Thank you," Lyra thought. "You, the quietest sentinel." She secured a new anchor into the right-hand ridge. The rope tightened. When she began lowering the retriever again, the pull was heavier than expected. But the dog didn't whimper, didn't resist. He stepped carefully, bracing himself not by command, but by the subtle signals from the collie's gaze, Rook's positioning, and the gentle tugs from Lyra behind. These 3, so different in breed and history, moved like a single practiced unit, held together not by orders but by trust. Whenever the retriever's step faltered, the collie would drop back, touching his nose to the shoulder. Whenever they slowed, Rook would pause on the ledge below, glance back, ears sharp as if counting their every step. Lyra didn't speak. She didn't need to. At this height, Even a word might trigger an unwanted reflex. She communicated through rope, through tension, through the brief flicker of eyes meeting eyes, when all four stopped in unison at a checkpoint. The valley below was now fully visible. Down there, the rescue team, her students, had gathered near the mountainside, the mirrored signal still flashing steadily in the agreed pattern. They probably believed those four were already on their way down. But Lyra knew this wasn't simply a descent anymore. It was a retrieval of lives, of beings who had almost disappeared. A rock fragment broke off from a nearby ridge, striking the ledge with a sharp echo. The retriever stumbled. The collie dropped instantly into a crouch, but Rook, he stood unmoving, like a statue in the wind. One glance back, his eyes met Lyra's. That was enough. Keep going. They moved another 10 meters. The angle eased slightly, but the rock grew slicker. Patches of moss, nourished by shade and mist, became quiet threats. When the retriever slipped, Lyra's hand pressed to his back, holding him steady just in time. Both collie and Rook halted immediately. No panic, just control. And when they saw the retriever had recovered, they continued, unhurried, unwavering. She realized then, this wasn't just a rescue team, it was a family. And she, the one who had descended not just from cliffs, but from her own past and fear, now found herself surrounded by beings more empathetic than any group of humans she'd ever led. As the sun touched the ridge across the valley, golden light stretched outward, blanketing them all like a soft quilt draping over the quiet arrival of an ending. Less than 30 meters remained. Rook lifted his paw one final time, placed it on a moss-covered outcrop, then turned to look back. The collie followed, light as wind through pine. The retriever, trembling, took his last step down, supported not just by the safety rope, but by Lyra's unwavering gaze. And then they touched ground. No applause, no cheers. But the moment Rook turned, padded over to Lyra, and rested his head silently in her hand, like a vow made in silence, it stilled the entire world around them. A transmission echoed from the radio, the breath of relief palpable in the voice below. "We're approaching your location. ETA 30 minutes. Hold position. Repeat, hold position." Lyra lowered the radio, nodding to the three dogs. Her legs trembled from hours anchored to rock, but her heart beat with a strange calm. Rook sat beside her, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if already keeping watch over whatever came next. A breeze swept up the canyon, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp stone. In that moment, Lyra placed her hand gently on Rook's neck, the gesture she always used to remind herself, "I'm still here, still breathing, still needed." But Rook didn't look at her like he usually did. Instead, he stood up suddenly, ears pointed, and turned back toward the slope they had just descended. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not a warning, but something urgent, whispered. Before she could react, Lyra felt a sudden tug at her coat. Rook's teeth had gripped the hem, firm but careful. "What is it, Rook?" No answer came, but his eyes, that knowing gaze that always seemed to read the unspoken, were locked onto a cluster of boulders about 10 meters away, a pile she had passed earlier during descent, but hadn't noticed. She squinted. Behind those rocks, obscured by shadow and layers of dust, was something that didn't belong to the landscape. A faint metallic stripe. Something flat. Long. Not large, but enough for Rook to have caught it in a fleeting glint of light. Lyra stepped closer. Rook walked beside her, never breaking focus. Up close, the boulders revealed their true nature, stacked from a recent landslide months ago. Sharp stone piled like they'd been flung into place and left in disarray. But what stopped her wasn't the structure, it was a dog collar, with a mirror, identical to the one on Rook's neck. It was dusty, tilted in the crevice, and the nameplate was worn down. Only the curve of a single letter remained visible. Lyra bent, picked it up, and just then, Rook gave a deep, husky growl. He stepped forward, pawing at a nearby stone, then stopped. He lowered his head and gently nudged the rock's edge, as if pointing. Beneath the rocks was a backpack. No words were needed. Lyra began lifting each stone carefully. They weren't heavy, just layered. All it took was precision, and within minutes the pack was revealed. Faded black, weathered by sun, one strap torn. On the surface, a stitched name patch, water-worn and barely legible. N.W. Her heart clenched. She had seen those initials before. 1 year ago, here, in the Grayson Range, she had filed the first report after a trainer disappeared during a landslide while guiding his dogs across the western gorge. They had only recovered 2 of the dogs. The man was never found. The name in the report, Nathaniel Walker. And now this backpack, still carrying the scent of old nylon, the scuff marks from climbing rope against stone, and a small laser-engraved metal tag tucked into the side pocket. Walker, emergency tag number 7223. Lyra gripped the tag tightly, her knuckles whitening. The wind moved through the rocks again. Rook stood beside her, unmoving. But his eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of a lost dog waiting to be rescued. They were the eyes of someone who had once waited for a return that never came. She turned to Rook and asked softly, "You knew him, didn't you?" Rook made no sound, but stepped forward, placing both front paws on the stone, then slowly lowered his head, as if nodding. When the rescue team radioed in again, she didn't respond. She sat between 4 rocks, the 3 dogs beside her, 3 collars in front of her, and an old backpack stained with the deep earth of Grayson. In that stillness, where the forest held its breath with dusk about to vanish, she whispered a name. Nathaniel? It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't hope. It was simply a whisper to the past. And sometimes the past, if called by its true name, can return. A late breeze swept in, carrying red dust that curled around Lyra's jacket as she stood in silence among 4 beings, 3 dogs and a backpack embroidered with a name long blurred. Rook's eyes were fixed northwest, where the last light slipped behind Grayson's ridge, casting a long shadow into the valley. There was something unresolved in his gaze, like a song left unfinished, a journey not yet complete. And as if on cue, Rook moved again, without hesitation, without waiting, just firm steps toward a low thicket between 2 slanted rocks, a hollow that had been hidden from view earlier, concealed by angle and light. But now, as the sun withdrew and shadows spoke, Lyra saw it. A mountain bike. The frame twisted, handlebars broken, 1 pedal buried deep in the soil. On the seat sat a gray helmet, cracked down the middle, a spiderweb of fractures from a brutal impact. Lyra knelt, her hand trembling as she touched it. A palm print remained, and dried blood around the rim. Rook gave a low growl, not out of fear, but something closer to memory. Lyra stood, her heart racing, not from altitude anymore, but from the current of sensation rushing back from the past. She followed a trail from the bike, a faint line across sandy rock, a path disturbed as if someone had crawled, desperate. And then she saw it. A hand, reaching from the gap between 2 slabs of stone, sun-darkened skin, dusted, trembling with a spasm. Lyra ran forward. "Is anyone here? I'm with the rescue team." No answer. But as she gently moved the stone aside, brushed away dry branches, a body emerged, curled, obscured by shadow and forgotten time. A man, about 35, in a weather-beaten charcoal jacket, arm wrapped over his chest, his face pale from dehydration. A deep gash scarred one cheek, dried blood crusting the wound. And a pendant had slipped from his collar, swinging slightly. On it, 3 engraved letters. Callan Drew. Lyra knew the name before her memory found the file. He was a former K9 handler who once led mountain tours in this very range, missing since a rock slide nearly a year ago. The file had read, "Presumed dead." But now, he was here, still alive. Weak pulse, but present. Callan, listen to me. I'm Lyra. I'm with Search and Rescue. Can you hear me?" Callan didn't respond, but his brow twitched, a fluttering breath, a fragile flicker between life and absence. Lyra uncapped her water, letting drops fall on his lips. His fingers curled slightly, weak but still reaching toward life. As the last drop touched the corner of his mouth, a low bark rang out beside her, quiet, deep, emotional. It was Rook. He hadn't taken his eyes off Callan since seeing that body, as if something inside him had never truly forgotten, only gone dormant. And now, as those eyes found the man who once meant everything, they awakened. Lyra stepped back, giving Rook space. He approached slowly, lowered his head, and nudged Callan's hand with his nose. Once. Twice. Then stopped, sitting beside him, resting his head gently on the man's chest. And in that stillness, without a single word, Callan let out a broken gasp. His hand trembled upward, reaching for something familiar. Another beat. His eyes opened just enough. "Rook." Just one word, soft as breath, but enough to make Lyra's throat tighten. She activated her radio, her voice unsteady but clear. "Rescue team, do you copy? I've found the missing person, Callan Drew, alive. Severe dehydration, possible head trauma. Immediate evac needed." The reply came swiftly. "ETA 10 minutes. Hold position. Medevac en route." Lyra nodded, eyes flicking between Callan and the 3 dogs now encircling him. In the last golden light of day, the wind rose again. But this time, it didn't carry dread or confusion. It brought something different, something that felt like return. And as Callan opened his eyes fully, seeing the forms around him, Rook, the collie, and the retriever curling close, their eyes bright with recognition, he began to cry. Not from pain, but because the things he thought he had lost were still here. The first sound wasn't the rotors. It was the soft clinking of rescue ropes, the hurried footsteps of the med team navigating the landslide debris. The wind flipped Lyra's jacket open, sweeping a layer of golden-brown dust around the rocks where Callan lay, as if even nature itself was watching over the man who had returned from the edge. Callan said nothing more, but his fingers gripped the fabric where Lyra's name was embroidered on her shirt, like the last anchor between a fading consciousness and a blurred reality. His half-open eyes, ringed with dried blood, still saw clearly. And when Rook leaned in, resting his head on Callan's chest once more, just a breath later, Callan's lips trembled. Rook. No long sentence, just a name. Yet in the way it was spoken, there was something deeper than memory. A thank you that didn't need words, a final call before letting go. "He's still responsive," Lyra said into the radio, her voice firm. From below, the team leader responded. "We see your mirror signal. Helicopter inbound. Prepare for extraction." Soon the distinct chop of rotor blades echoed from the east, spinning across the scarlet evening sky. Rook didn't bark. He simply lifted his head, his eyes calm, as if he understood something greater was unfolding. Lyra knelt beside Callan as the medics reached them. They quickly checked vital signs, began IV hydration, and patched the gash on his forehead. A flexible stretcher was rolled out, lifting Callan with care, as if not to disturb a memory just rediscovered after a long silence. "Vitals temporarily stable," one medic reported. "But we need to move now." As they secured the stretcher and prepared to guide it through the narrow rocks, Callan's eyes opened again. This time they didn't seek Lyra. They searched for Rook. The gaze wasn't urgent or rushed. It was quiet, like he wanted to imprint something one last time. Rook stepped forward. He didn't whine, didn't howl, didn't leap. He just walked forward and rested his head on Callan's chest once more, for the last time. A small, simple gesture, but it made every rescuer freeze, because in that moment a goodbye was spoken. Wordless, yet whole. Callan tried to say something, but his lips cracked. No sound came. Lyra leaned in close. "Don't let him go back alone." That was all. Then Callan closed his eyes. Not a farewell, just slipping into rest, as if only after seeing Rook again and knowing the pack was alive could his heart allow itself to rest. The stretcher was lifted into the helicopter. Wind whipped Lyra's hair, sending grit into her face. But she didn't blink. She watched as the stretcher rose, watched the man disappear behind the steel door, and the helicopter drift into the reddening sky. And from that moment until the rotor noise faded into distance, Rook didn't turn away. He stood at the cliff's edge, the last light tracing the dark fur along his back. He didn't howl, didn't dig, didn't chase. He just stood there, like a silent sentinel, seeing his handler off, ready to stay behind. Lyra placed her hand gently on his back. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered. "That back then, it wasn't the end." Rook glanced at her, a slow, deep look, and then turned. Not to leave, but to head back toward the backpack and the two dogs waiting by the rock's base. Lyra followed, and in her chest something became clear. This rescue wasn't just to save a man. It was to reconnect what had once been severed between past and present, between a man who had fallen and the three lives that never left each other. Rook turned back one last time, looked at Lyra. And this time, his gaze held more than trust. It held choice. The hospital's waiting hall wasn't washed in sterile white. The light was softer, warmer, as late sunlight slanted through the corridor windows leading to the rehab wing. On a wooden bench against the wall, Lyra sat, arms still marked by scrapes from the rocks, shirt dulled by wind and dust, not yet changed. Beside her, Rook lay quietly, head resting on her boot, as if accepting this place as part of the journey. After the rescue, they descended the mountain with the med team. The border collie had a leg checked. The retriever mix had a few scratches but wagged his tail. Rook needed no nurse. He just followed Lyra, calm, steady, as if still guarding the one who once led him, even if she wore a different face now. A young nurse stepped in, smiling gently. "Mr. Callan Drew is awake." He asked, "Has Miss Lyra arrived yet?" Lyra gave a slight nod and ran her hand softly along Rook's thick back. Rook lifted his head, glanced toward the door, and moved with her, like a quiet shadow that had always been there. When the hospital room door opened, the sharp scent of antiseptic mingled with the earthy sweetness of dried wildflowers left by someone at the bedside. The mixture softened the air, as if trying to calm something deeper than pain. Callan lay on the bed. His face was hollowed, but his eyes held an uncanny brightness. And when he saw Rook enter first, that light in his eyes sharpened again. "He's still with you," Callan murmured. His voice was like wind brushing water, faint but not weightless. "We never parted," Lyra said, stepping closer. "Rook kept leading me, even when I thought I was the one guiding him." Callan gave a soft laugh, gripping the blanket slightly as the effort pulled at his chest. He's always been that way. Never loud, just faithful. Rook placed a paw gently on the side of the bed, then rested his head near Callan's heart. For a moment, every sound in the room faded away, making space for a silence of a different kind, the quiet of something that had just been restored. The door opened again. A woman stepped in, her face pale with worry long endured. But when she saw Callan and Rook together, her eyes shimmered like someone stepping out from a long rain. "Maria," Callan whispered, reaching toward her. She walked over and wrapped her arms around him softly. Rook shifted aside, and for the first time since the landslide, Lyra saw a family being pieced back together, not through promises, but through survival and loyalty. When the moment settled, Maria turned to Lyra. "I don't even know what to say," she murmured, "but thank you feels too small." Lyra shook her head, her voice gentle, as though afraid to touch something still too fragile. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "No," Maria said, her eyes still on Rook. "You weren't just there. You listened, to things others ignored. You kept climbing, when others would have stopped. And Rook, he knew." Rook lay still, ears perked, not alert, but attentive, as if listening to words that didn't need to be spoken. "We thought," Maria continued, voice deepening, "that after the accident, after the loss, he'd close himself off. But seeing Rook by your side, I realized some bonds are born from courage." Lyra didn't speak. Her hand rested on Rook's back. For the first time since recognizing him on that cliff, she felt it. Not that she had found him, but that he had chosen her. "You know," Maria added softly, "Rook used to be the one guiding the other two, but since the rescue, his eyes have always been looking toward one direction. Not me, not Callan." She smiled, not with envy, but understanding. "But toward you." Callan nodded faintly, placing his frail hand on Rook's leg in agreement. "He chose you, Lyra. And maybe, after everything, that's how fate answers those who never turn away from a life in need." Outside the window, sunlight brushed gently across the hospital awning, lighting up hanging pots of golden marigold and trailing pothos vines. The whole scene looked like a summer painting, quiet, peaceful, untroubled. Lyra stood, lightly touching Rook's head. "Well then, if you've chosen," she whispered, "we'll keep going, won't we?" Rook raised his head. That look, plain and steady, was as clear as a silent yes. It was a morning filled with real sunlight, not the flickering brightness of early winter, nor the harsh blaze of dry season, but a soft, certain kind, the kind that begins a new day without fanfare. Lyra sat on the steps outside the hospital, a cup of ginger tea still steaming gently in her hand. Rook lay beside her, ears flicking now and then by instinct, but his eyes half-lidded with a kind of peace that only comes to those who've passed through too much noise, and now ask only for quiet. Callan stepped out with Maria. His gait was slow, but his face had relaxed, no longer clenched by pain. He leaned on a cane, but his eyes were firm, a steadiness born not of strength, but of gratitude. "Lyra," he called, like one would call a friend, not a savior. She set the cup down and stood. Rook rose too, padding toward him. "I think it's time," Callan said, eyes tracing every step of Rook. "He's done everything I ever taught him, and even things I couldn't." Lyra didn't answer. The late spring breeze brushed past her sleeves, carrying the scent of fresh grass and petals suspended in the air like flying specks of sunlight. "I used to think," Callan went on, "that a good dog obeyed every order, feared no noise, never left a task undone. But then, he chose you, without waiting for anyone's command." Rook looked up at Lyra, then at Callan. No bark, just a gaze, so clear it needed no interpreter. A young nurse stepped forward with a soft smile. "Mr. Callan Drew is awake," he asked. "Has Miss Lyra arrived yet?" Lyra gave a gentle nod, her hand brushing along Rook's thick back. The dog lifted his head, glanced toward the door, then walked beside her like a familiar shadow. As the hospital room door opened, the sterile scent of antiseptic blended with the faint aroma of dried grass from a small bouquet someone had left on the bedside table, softening the atmosphere. Callan Drew lay there, his face gaunt, but his eyes shone with a strange clarity. And when he saw Rook enter first, those eyes brightened once more. "He's still with you," Callan whispered, his voice like wind skimming over still water, fragile, yet holding weight. "We never parted," Lyra replied as she stepped forward. "Rook has always led the way, even when I thought I was the one guiding him." Callan let out a soft chuckle, gripping the blanket as the laughter stirred pain in his chest. "He's always been like that. Doesn't need many words. Just trust." Rook placed a paw on the bed frame and gently rested his head on Callan's chest. In that instant, every sound in the room seemed to dissolve, replaced by a stillness that felt like something long lost being quietly restored. The door opened again. A woman entered, her face pale from lingering worry. But when she saw Callan and Rook, her eyes shimmered as if she'd just stepped out of a long storm. "Maria," Callan breathed, reaching for her. She came closer, embracing him gently. Rook moved aside, and for the first time since the rock slide, Lyra witnessed a family reknit, not with promises, but through survival and quiet loyalty. When the room calmed, Maria turned to Lyra. "I don't know what to say," she began hesitantly, "but thank you doesn't feel like enough." Lyra shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper, as though afraid to disturb something still too tender. "I was just in the right place, at the right time." "No," Maria replied, her gaze resting on Rook. "You weren't just there. You listened, to the sound others ignored. You kept climbing, when others turned back. And Rook, he knew that." Rook remained still, his ears perked as if tuning into things left unsaid. "We thought," Maria continued, her voice softening, "that after the accident, after the losses, he would shut down. But seeing him walk beside you, I understand now. New bonds are born from courage." Lyra said nothing. Her hand rested on Rook's back. For the first time since recognizing that dog on the cliff, she didn't feel like the one who found him, but the one who had been chosen. "You know," Maria whispered, "Rook was the lead dog among the three. But ever since the descent, his eyes have looked in one direction, not toward me or Callan." She smiled, not with jealousy, but with something that felt like quiet clarity. "But toward you." Callan nodded slowly, placing his worn hand gently on Rook's leg, as if confirming it. "He's chosen you, Lyra. And maybe, just maybe, that's how fate repays those who never turn away from a life worth saving." Outside the window, sunlight spilled softly over the hospital eaves, lighting up the hanging planters, marigold yellow, pothos green, like a quiet summer canvas untouched by noise. Lyra stood and lightly tapped Rook's head. "So, if you've chosen," she murmured, "then I guess we keep walking, don't we?" Rook lifted his head. That look, clear and simple, was as good as a wordless yes. It was a sunny morning. Truly sunny, not the hesitant kind of early winter, nor the harsh blaze of an April drought. The light was crisp and kind, like the start of a new day that didn't need fanfare. Lyra sat on the hospital steps, a steaming cup of ginger tea in her hand. Rook lay beside her, ears alert by instinct, but eyes gently closed, a peace earned by one who had walked through the noise of broken things and now only wished to rest. Callan stepped out with Maria. His steps were still slow, but his face had softened, no longer drawn by pain. He leaned on a cane, but his eyes were steady, the kind of steadiness that comes from gratitude, not strength. "Lyra," he called, like one calling to a friend, not to a savior. She set her tea down and stood. Rook rose too, walking toward Callan. "I think it's time," Callan said, watching every movement of Rook. "He's done everything I ever trained him for, and more I never could." Lyra didn't answer. A soft spring breeze passed through the thin fabric of her sleeves, carrying the scent of new grass and drifting petals like floating dusts of gold. "I used to think," Callan continued, "that a good dog was one who obeyed every command, wasn't shaken by sirens, never abandoned a task. But then, he chose you, without a word." Rook looked up at Lyra, then back at Callan. No bark, no dramatic gesture. Just a gaze so clear it needed no translation. Maria placed a hand on Callan's shoulder. He turned to her, then back to Lyra, pulling something small from his pocket. A worn leather key fob, once part of Rook's training harness during 7 years of service. "I kept this every time we swapped his gear," Callan said, offering it to Lyra. "Now, I think it's time someone else holds on to it, not to remind Rook what to do, but to remind us that some loyalties aren't trained, they're chosen." Lyra took it. The leather was warm, having rested close to Callan's heart, and suddenly, everything she thought had passed rushed back. Rook's gaze on the cliff's edge, his quiet breath against the mountain wind, the silence that always felt like a promise. "I won't treat him like something I own," Lyra said softly. "I'll just walk with him, for as long as he wants to walk." Callan smiled. Maria whispered, "And Rook will walk. He already chose." The three of them stood there. No more words, just sunlight and wind and the quiet sound of something unspoken. Rook stepped beside Lyra and gently pressed his head into her hand, a gesture so simple it dissolved any distance like morning fog. "No leash needed," Callan said. "He knows where he wants to go. All he needs is someone willing to go with him." When Lyra turned to leave, Rook walked at her side. No call, no pull of rope, no command shouted after. Only 2 footsteps, one human, one canine, and the long, quiet shadow they left behind on the cobbled path leading away from the hospital. That afternoon, in the small cabin at the valley's edge where Lyra was staying, she opened the door for Rook. He didn't bark, just gave her a look, then made a slow round through the house, as if inspecting it, not with scent but with trust. Rook lay down by the window, in the one spot where afternoon light had just touched the wooden floor, his eyes half closed. Lyra sat beside him, placing the leather key fob on the table. She didn't plan to hang it anywhere, just wanted to keep it as a reminder that some bonds need no certificate, no verbal promise of stay or come. They form themselves, like dew on morning leaves, like how Rook stepped beside her when no one else dared climb further. That day, no one cried. But something had been spoken, through a gaze, through silence, through the quiet breath that follows a long, tilting journey. A farewell, not in words, but in a nod of understanding. And a beginning, carried by the same silence, now full of everything that matters. Morning light spread over the slopes of Grayson like a soft ribbon unfurled from the sky. The air was clear, carrying scents of moss, warm stone, and the dampness left from last night's rain. Lyra's 6 students, 3 boys, 3 girls, walked in single file, footsteps even, quiet. They didn't know the meaning behind each crack in the rock ahead, but their faces had settled into something still, like they sensed something passing through an unseen layer of space. Lyra led them. Rook walked on her left. No leash. They hadn't needed one in a long time. Since the day they first stepped off the cliffside, something else had tethered them. Deeper, truer, beyond words. "We won't summit today," Lyra said softly, just loud enough for her students to hear, without breaking the rising hush among the stones. "We're just passing a place, but it's a place that changed my life." No one asked, why? No giggles, no casual chatter like those early days of class. Even the Grayson Range seemed quieter, wind gentler, birds soaring instead of singing, preserving the stillness of this stretch of trail. The cliff bend came into view, the very spot, over a year ago, where Lyra had climbed trembling, cleared stones, knotted ropes, and found those brown eyes wide and alert at the edge of life and death. A dog named Rook. She stopped. The 6 students followed suit. Rook stepped forward slowly, then lifted his head, gazing straight up at the high ridge. His eyes didn't tremble, didn't wander, just recognized, with clarity and reverence, the place where he'd once been left behind, and where someone had come back for him. No one said a word, but in that moment, they all understood. Rook stood still for a long while, then turned to look at Lyra. Nothing dramatic. No bark, no leaping embrace, just a look. The same one they'd shared back on that cliff, full enough that no words dared interrupt it. "I thought only people remembered their way home," Ava, the youngest of the group, whispered. Her voice wasn't surprised, just a little shaky, like she'd learned something not written in any textbook. Lyra smiled and gently ran her hand along Rook's back. "Not to remember in order to return," she whispered, "but to remember we made it through." One of the students, Thomas, quietly pointed toward the ledge above. "Is that where you rescued him?" Lyra nodded. But Rook didn't take his eyes off her, as if to say, "You didn't save me. We saved each other." After that short pause, the group moved on. No one spoke, yet each step felt lighter, steadier, as though everyone carried something newly understood, even if they couldn't name it. As the sun rose higher, casting slanted light between rocky cracks and splintering into 1,000 glints on the dew-wet grass, Rook suddenly ran ahead. He didn't go far, just enough to turn back, tail wagging, as if to say, "Come on, there's more ahead." Lyra watched him, and something familiar stirred inside her, a feeling close to freedom, but woven with responsibility. She realized then what Rook had truly taught her wasn't just how to save a life, but how to live a meaningful one, step by step, with care and without fear. They ended the hike just before sunset. As the last rays lingered on the rocks, Lyra sat beside her students. They shared warm tea and crumbling biscuits and spoke of what they had learned today. No one mentioned height or speed, only what they felt. "Courage isn't about how high you climb," Mason said. "It's about taking another step, even when you're not sure there's a path." "And what if no one's leading?" Ava asked. Thomas pointed at Rook. "Then maybe someone with 4 legs will find you." That night, back in the little cabin lit by soft golden light, Lyra sat at the wooden table, scribbling in a journal whose edges were worn with use. Rook lay curled near the fireplace, tail twitching slightly at the sound of pen on paper. Lyra paused, looked up, and whispered, perhaps only to herself, "Sometimes a climb doesn't end at the summit. It ends in the moment you realize you didn't give up." Rook didn't answer, but the firelight in his eyes, warm, steady, alive, seemed to smile back. We may never fully understand the inner world of a German shepherd, a creature of quiet empathy, fierce protection, and boundless loyalty. But the story of Lyra and Rook gives us a glimpse of something real, that sometimes it is the silent ones who teach us how to live most fully. Rook wasn't just the dog who got rescued. He became a companion, a quiet lantern guiding a girl through wounds no one could see. In every climb, every glance back, Rook reminded her that trust doesn't come from commands, but from presence, from eyes that listen, from breathing side by side without the need to explain. This story isn't only about a rescue on a cliff's edge. It is a symphony of trust between two species, between human and dog, between a soul that once collapsed and a heart that never gave up on hope. So love animals, not just because they need us, but because we need them too. To remind us that in a world that spins too fast, there are still bonds that require no reason, only truth strong enough to keep us standing. And if one day a dog looks into your eyes with something that feels like a message, don't be surprised. You might have just found what you were missing.